can begin right now with programs for retrofitting our buildings and financing community solar. We can support small family farms by investing in regenerative agriculture to provide more sustainable local foods. We'll hear more about that. And for example, we can expand the Sonoma County Food System Alliance. We can provide our frontline communities training for the dream jobs and to build affordable housing. And we can begin right now by providing zero interest loans to build 10,000 accessory dwelling units right here in Sonoma County. And this pandemic has shown us that we must provide adequate and affordable healthcare for all. We can choose to do what really matters for our future and the future of our grandchildren. I believe this is a golden swan moment, and our speakers today will show us how we can support our community while we begin to transform our economy using the One Planet principles to meet the climate and COVID challenges. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Again, I'm take a breath and envisioning applause. I'm more optimistic on our local governance at the county and city level than I have been in 15 years. I'm hopeful for our community as we transition from these regular emergencies into a state of realizing the biggest emergency at hand, and we know that's climate change. I believe personally, as Robert does, that we have the right assets in our community to move forward. And part of that asset is our great agricultural resources. So I'm thrilled today to join by three amazing sustainable food advocates. We're going to have a conversation about food security, what's really at risk in our future, food, farming, farms, gardens, and gardening. And so I'm joined today by three amazing collaborators. Genevieve Taylor, the Executive Director of Ag Innovations. She's also one of the founders of this event. An early advocate for clear communications, and somebody I've always seen as addressing the pressing issues of our time. We're also joined in this panel by Timra Costa, a partner at Green Valley Farm and Mill. Timra is a sustainable food and farming advocate and the award-winning author of Farmer Jane, Women Changing the Way We Eat. I didn't know that when we met. We met on a playground, and it's one of the things about Sonoma County that I love so much is we're just rich with talented and amazing advocates. And another one is Evan Wigg. He's the Director of Membership and Communications for the Community Alliance with Family Farmers. He's a community organizer with a passion for regenerative agriculture and also a rock star. And so thank you all for joining us this morning. In preparation for this event, we had a few discussions about food security and food systems. It seemed like right after shelter in place, food was everything I heard about for the first couple of weeks. When we first dialogued about it, I was very appreciative about how Evan suggested I frame the conversation in terms of gardening. Are we talking about gardening or are we talking about farming? And so I've been really encouraged to see a lot of activity around gardening in our community. And gardening is really good. It's an important feature, and it could, in the past, it has been a way that we generated a lot of food. But it's not currently where we get our food, most of us. And so right now the stores still look good when I go in. But the question that we had was, how will we know if there's a coming food crisis? And what kind of activities can we do to prepare for that? So when you start, I believe we're going to start with Evan. Evan, a quick word about where you are in the community you represent as you dive into this topic. And you are muted right now. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you so much for having me here. It's an incredibly important topic, and I'm glad that this could take start off our day when we're talking about the essentials of how we survive our food system. So Community Alliance of Family Farmers is an organization that's been around since the 1970s, advocating for sustainable agriculture, family farms, and local food systems. And so when I was asked to talk about the issues of food security, it got me thinking about what that word really means and how, food security usually implies the immediate availability of food, which is incredibly important, making sure that people who need food have it and that we have enough food to go around. But that's the outcome, not the process, which is where I think we should be focused. How is that food produced? How does it get from the field to the plate? And how are all the people along the way impacted? We're living in an era of massive change, from pandemics to global warming to wildfires. And instead of just thinking about food security, we should be thinking about food resilience, food sovereignty, and food equity. So when I say resilience, are the systems we depend on flexible, or do we depend on just a few rigid, consolidated bottlenecks? Like when thousands of workers test positive for coronavirus at a meatpacking plant, the very few meatpacking plants that we have left, as we've seen smaller scale packing plants close and consolidate, and the meat industry consolidate. In those cases, it's so rigid and so inflexible that our nation's leaders are compelled to mandate that these packing plants reopen for fear that the whole system will break despite the health of those workers. Or when families line up at food banks when just down the road a farmer's plowing in their fields because of sudden market disruption. Or food sovereignty. Do local communities have a say in how their food gets produced, or are they given a false choice? Either deal with exploitation, deal with degradation and the decisions of industry leaders far removed from these communities, or else, sorry, no food. And then the last one, of course, is equity. Let's not only do all people have equitable access to food, which is incredibly important, but also whether there's an equitable access to the industry that creates our food. We're not just consumers, we're producers, each and every one of us. So who gets to own a farm? Who gets to own a restaurant or open up a grocery store? We're gonna see a lot of consolidation in the years ahead. I think that's one of as much as I think there's opportunities for golden swans, I think what we're also gonna see is a lot of mom and pop shops closing down, not being able to recover from this. And what we're probably going to see is a lot of bigger, more resourced companies with deeper lines of credit swooping in to fill that void. They're picking up on delivery, e-commerce, really getting ahead of the game and using venture capital and deep pockets to weather a storm that smaller businesses, farms, restaurants, food businesses don't have. But our larger systems, collectively, our political systems, are they set up to support these smaller businesses during this time? I think that's really what we should be asking right now. We've already seen that these bigger companies are ready and willing to reap the benefits of government programs specifically designed to support smaller businesses, as we've seen with the PPP program and other programs that were specifically designed to help mom and pop stores. And this has been the model for a long time. So the challenges that our food system are facing right now in this very moment, it's not just about the quantity of food and whether or not we're going to have enough. It's never really about the quantity of food that we have. We grow enough food on this earth to feed every single person just fine. Yet some people will go hungry while others are plowing under their crops. We have enough food, we grow enough food, but the definition of food security should include whether we all have a say in how our food system operates and not just that there is food available, and whether or not that food system is flexible and resilient enough to be able to adapt when these pandemics hit or the next thing hits, or as we face what's a much larger crisis than the one we're dealing with right now, which is climate change. So when I think about food resilience or food security and whether or not, whether or not our food system is at risk right now, the question is more about the human element and whether who is involved and who it's going to affect.
Right on. So what I hear from that is affluent people won't go hungry yet. And so Genevieve, do you want to comment on this topic?
Yeah, so maybe I should say just a little bit about our work. Ag Innovations was the convener and facilitator for over a dozen food system alliances throughout the state, and it's been a long road. We're working more on kind of ag and natural resources issues, but at this moment. But what we have discovered during that time is that, just like Evan was saying, it's about the connections between each of those different parts of the food supply. So between farmer to distributor, or excuse me, farmer to processor to distributor to consumer, and then all of the political context that's happening around that. So one of the things that I've been thinking about is that this moment has really clarified the weaknesses in our food system in a much more global, very specific, highly visual way. So if we think of it, as Evan was saying, as something that's rigid, if we think of it as a canal, for example, we now understand that the canals that connect farmers with restaurants are different from the canals that connect farmers with grocery stores, or farmers with their farmers markets or their consumers. And the length of that and its movement around the planet is really clear to us. And we can see what happens when a packing house is shut down. It really, it's very easy to block that. And what is interesting in that space is that there's a moment, I think resilience comes from, first of all, acknowledging that, but then also, the innovation that I am seeing at this moment has to do with how those things are connected. Are they able to leap to different canals? Are we able to kind of break down those boundaries and make it a little bit more of a natural system? The problem is that there's the most vulnerable are always the ones that are impacted first in that space. And so I'm hearing stories of small coastal rural communities where children who've been receiving, wonderfully prepared scratch meals are now not able to receive that, and the difference that it's making in terms of their nutrition. So that's the one side of it. On the other side, those same kids are potentially having a new consideration of those meals, because I think even in this, in the United States, we're privileged. We waste food all the time. And I think our mindfulness about how we view food, who produces it, who prepares it, who serves it to us, and how it gets to our plate, what it means to throw away part of a pizza that's been sitting in the fridge for a couple of weeks, what that means in terms of getting new pizza, is just much more clearer. So I think that this is a moment when the food system becomes extremely personal, and there's a lot of power in that deep personal connection.
That's it feels like these issues, like the issue is exacerbated, but it feels so much like the conversation we've been having for a while. Timra, do you want to chime in on this topic? You're muted.
Great, thank you. Yes, I would like to chime in. Thank you, it's great to be here. Thanks for inviting me, and Evan and Genevieve, thanks for all your points, really well articulated, and some of the challenges that we're facing regarding food security. As a co-owner of a farm here in Western Sonoma County, we're really well aware of how this crisis has impacted our farmers here in the land. We have 2 independently owned farms here, and so we're seeing a real shift in people's priorities. Yet we know that this food isn't accessible and available to all. So that's part of my work in the world, is thinking about these things. I wanted to share this image. This was, there was a report done that was published last year by the University of Illinois that actually looked at food flows between counties in the United States. And this was a map that was generated from that. California is a major driver of food production for the entire United States. Some of our counties, San Benito, all the way down south, are some of the major suppliers. So when you ask that question of, will we see a disruption to our food system here locally? The answer is probably, but not as much as New York is experiencing right now. So we're seeing a big difference. So California is a major food supplier with some of the major food central distribution hubs for the entire country, means that we're in closer proximity to these foods. However, I would argue that Sonoma County is really well positioned to be producing enough and ample food for itself. We're still importing a lot of foods. To Evan's point, there's plenty of food to go around, yet it's not getting to everyone that needs it. So in thinking ahead of how will this impact us and our food shelves now? Well, we're seeing a little bit of that, mostly in reduction of some commodities, but not enough to make people extremely concerned. And people are responding a bit by looking for CSA or community supported agriculture programs to become a member of a farm. And I think that was the point that I really wanted to bring home today, is that people need more investment in local food systems, more connection, and more direct sourcing from our producers. And Sonoma County and the North Bay has so many of those pieces in place. If you look at the distribution represented in this map, we're very fortunate to have Feed Sonoma. That's an aggregate for food providers in the county. I think that we have just so many great resources that we could amplify, we could grow. We have so many food distribution services. So there's so much here in place already. And I was really impressed to see that the Food Systems Alliance had met to talk about emergency food in March. So there are already conversations happening. Evan was there, Genevieve, I'm sure you're aware of that meeting if you weren't in attendance, but our county is already thinking about these things. And I think that there's some clear steps that have already been identified by numerous county organizations that could really help assist in amplifying our capacity to feed ourselves now and into the future under crisis.
Well, that's exactly where this conversation is headed, right? And so that we've had a discussion a few times about the amount of row crops that we're growing, apples, ranches, and then the amount of wine, the amount of agriculture and wine. And so I pose this question back, what are your thoughts on how much food we should be growing here?
Mm-hmm.
And how do people really get involved and support that movement of growing more food here?
Yes, that's a great question that I've been mulling over, and I'm sure all of the panelists will be able to speak to this question. In looking at the county, there's 1.132 million acres of land. So Sonoma County has ample land. Currently, there's about 60,000 acres of grape production, and there's a little bit less than 500 acres in row crops or vegetable production. There's an ample dairy industry already in existence. There's cattle ranching and some pasture and small animal production, but it doesn't appear to be sufficient to feed our 494,336 people in the county. Thank you, Oren, for that number. So what we're missing is equitable access to land. I believe is the dominant barrier to entry for more food production, and also the dominance of the wine industry in our county. We have grapes here at Green Valley and we love grapes, but 60,000 acres is quite a bit. And I understand why. Being a co-owner of land, there are very few agricultural related propositions that make sense to be able to afford the high cost of land in this area. And conventional wisdom would tell us, plant every acre in Pinot Noir. So, and we're not doing that here. So we as a land-based entity and property have to find alternative ways to pay the bills and pay the really steep property taxes that we're dealing with. So I have some suggestions and other ideas I'd like to share during the next section about what a really resilient food system could look like here. But I just want to say we need about 2 acres per person, I think, to be a very regeneratively produced food system. So some estimates are as low as 1 acre. I would argue that that's a dominant industrial paradigm acreage amount, and that we actually need a little bit more to allow land to fallow, to really take into consideration buffer zones and biodiversity and wildlife corridors. So we actually need a little bit more land than I think is being accounted for. And this geopolitical distinction about Sonoma County is also semi-problematic in itself, because perhaps we don't have the best land for growing grain. So does that mean that we have to grow every commodity ourselves? I don't think so, but I do think we could be doing better utilizing the land that we have in production, and also doing some sort of mandatory ag use on properties that are sitting fallow most of the year. And that's part of the housing crisis we're facing too. I'll just
Wow.
leave it there.
Genevieve, Evan, do you want to jump right on that?
You know, Tamara's talking about the heart of the question, which is what is local, and what are the kind of systems dynamics that are in place that really underpin the economics, really, of a food system. I mean, I would say that it's probably better to think broader, and it's possible for us to grow, I think, on a home basis. Like, you know, I think there's all sorts of interesting work right now that's talking about generative, I'm not even saying regenerative, but self-sufficient farming that's happening for locals. But that's a very rare set of circumstances that actually makes that happen. And I think the reality is that most farmers have to bring in other forms of income. And so unless they have a cash crop like wine or marijuana or something else, they're going to need to, it's hard to create the kind of farming income that they need. There are some that are proving that in different ways. They're you know, working on it in different ways, but there's all sorts of debate about that. And those really have to do with farmers' choices about what they feel comfortable with, what they know, how to grow, and what they found successful in their generation, perhaps past generations. So, I mean, I think that question of could we be self-sufficient in Sonoma County, I think it's more like, could we be more sufficient, more resilient in California? And can we think about how we use, you know, some of the efficiencies really that are gained from our economic forces, as well as help people to bring to reel in the food system so that it's closer to them, so it's closer to home, and they're able to either produce themselves or work with the farmers that are as close as possible to what they're doing. So I think it's a really complicated question. I'd also say, you know, grain probably doesn't grow that great here. I know there's a few experiments around here, but there's other places where it grows, and trade is a really important part of human evolution. So, you know, if we get stuck into kind of our idealized version of what it should look like, I think we lose out on a lot of possibilities.
So yeah, I can pick it up there. I think that's a really interesting concept. Is there is definitely this sort of bucolic ideal of growing all of our own food on our own little homesteads, or at least within our own regions. And I do think that it's possible to diversify, and healthy from an ecological and economic perspective, to diversify and not have a single monocrop dominate any one region. But yeah, to say that grain is going to be the most appropriate here, or that, I mean, I'm a big coffee drinker, right? I'm not going to assume I'm going to be getting my coffee here from Sonoma County, right? But I think that the question that all of us can be asking about what local resilience looks like, and why it's important, is that the further you move from where you are, we're talking from a political standpoint, the less say you have in how your food is produced, or how anything is produced. So the way that, you know, you have your local jurisdiction, your city, or your town, and you have your county and its set of laws. Then you have your states, and then nations. So we put in labor laws, we put in environmental protections, we put in protections of communities. And the further you move out, the less say you have. So as a citizen, I live here in Sebastopol. As a citizen of Sebastopol, I can lobby my local government to implement rules on how to protect the environment and affordable housing and things like that. And then I go out to the county, I have a little bit less say. There's more people vying for those. But by the time you get to importing products from, you know, say, for instance, a third world country, we don't have a lot of say. So we may be able to vote our ideals. We may be able to go to the ballot and say, I want to vote for farm worker protections. I want to vote for affordable housing. I want to vote for water protections. But you can vote as much as you want on local issues, but you don't necessarily get to vote on the ecological preservation of the natural resources in Colombia, right? And if you're getting your coffee from there, then you don't have a say in that. So I think that one of the big questions is, if we're not going to strive for that local ideal of growing all of our own foods, how can we make sure that the values that we implement on a local level are being implemented when we do have trade, when we do recognize that maybe they are better at growing coffee than we are? Then is it simply going to be a market-based solution and assume that consumers are going to make those decisions? I think it's a good place. I think it's a good starting point, but I don't think it's going to be the systemic change that we need to replicate it to the critical mass that we need. So how can we, from our sourcing, from our own policies about imports, how can we make sure that the values that we think are important to implement at the local level also get applied to the economies and the ecosystems and the communities that we depend on for all the things that we can't produce? So it's a much bigger question, and it's a lot harder and more complex than can I grow salad in my backyard, or can I join a CSA down the road? But it's something that we should all be asking if we believe in the values that we vote for.
So that prompts an instant question that I didn't pre-pepper you guys with, but is our food system becoming more sustainable? Like in the last 20 years, are the industrial growers and the large growers taking a step forward on water use and human rights and taking care of the planet? Genevieve?
I mean, I would have to say yes. Human evolution is it's a strong force, and we work with a group called the California Water Action Collaborative, and they're doing pretty amazing things. Now, some of it is you look at the companies and you're wondering, oh, what does that really mean? But what I know is that their goals are profound and have been transformational inside many of those companies, despite some of the disconnects that might happen in terms of their business model. So it's an interesting moment. What I also understand is that working with global companies, when you talk to them, especially we work with a lot of directors of sustainability, and so you talk to them about their the kinds of requirements that they have to go through around the world. And when they talk about their California farming operations versus the ones that they are doing in South Africa or in Africa, really, or in China, the questions that have to be answered there, where you seriously have to answer them, are just a non-issue here. It's just the quality of farming that's in California based on our regulations is so much higher. Now, that does not mean that there's not improvement that needs to be done. That doesn't mean that even our regulations always produce the outcomes that they're intended to produce. And those regulations actually make it harder for small businesses to survive. It makes it much easier for a large company that has a compliance officer or a sustainability director to meet those requirements and be able to find those markets than it would be for a small producer to be able to meet that. And so that's really an issue. And I think we see that in regulations. We see that with crisis. We see that in kind of these new markets, the kind of transformative markets space that we're seeing now, this online access and all of that. It's the larger companies who are most set up to be resilient. So, I really do believe that California is a step above of many other places in the world. And there's always trade-offs. There's a reason why things happen, why systems are in place for in the way they are, and there's always trade-offs in how those actually manifest. There's unintended consequences.
I guess yeah, I think I would point to the word that you used, which is it sustainable? And can the concept of sustainability. Can we sustain what we have? I don't think that we can necessarily sustain what we have, nor, you know, and you said, you know, in the past few decades, right? You know, our global population has about doubled in the past few decades. So the circumstances are certainly changing. New challenges have arisen. But if you look at the past few decades, the systems we have are not sustainable. They weren't sustainable a few decades ago, and they're not sustainable right now. We are depleting aquifers. We are using fossil fuels and overtilling land in ways that contribute to climate change, and to a degree that at this point is irreversible. We can potentially mitigate. We can certainly use regenerative agricultural practices to capture some of that carbon. But at this point, we really need to be focusing not just on can we slow that, but number one, I mean, if we can work to reverse some of those effects, that's great, and we should be working towards that. But at this point, I think that the question is, can we adapt to the new normal? That things do look very differently now, and they will look incredibly more. I mean, we won't be able to grow almonds in the Central Valley in just a couple of decades. We won't be able to grow avocados in San Diego. I guarantee that the wonderful grape varieties that we all know and love here in Sonoma County probably won't be feasible here in a few decades. So I think that people are taking big steps. We've seen here California certainly being a leader in terms of policy by implementing things like the Healthy Soils Initiative, which provides financial incentives for farmers of all scales to make transitions towards more regenerative practices, using cover crops, reducing their tillage, putting in hedgerows, all these practices that we've been advocating for decades. But we're really going to have to be asking, how do we adapt in a larger way and to these changes that are at this point probably beyond our control.
Well, and I feel like, just to follow up, I should clarify that sustainability, there's kind of two different elements of it. Is the reality that we have sustainable? And that's, I think, really, Evan, what you're speaking to so clearly. I'm not saying that agriculture doesn't need to change and shouldn't change and is like not faced with all of these pressures right now. But I do believe that there's a lot in place that would lead us toward the future that we need. And it's really important, I believe, to acknowledge that as a strength for California. And because if we don't acknowledge that, then it's hard for us to build that new future together. So I think it's a yes and with what I'm saying and with what you're saying, Evan.
Mm-hmm.
Genevieve, I love your optimism as you present that information about the corporations and their models for sustainability. And I am seeing the numbers and the consolidation happening with farming, and how less resilient small to medium-sized producers are to climate change and the impacts of one lost harvest. In 2014, FAO estimated that we had 60 harvests left if soil degradation were to continue at the rate that it is. And we know that the degradation of our soils is also causing a lessening of the nutrient density of the very foods that we're eating. So the corporate answer to farming, the robotics of farming, we are in the heart of this movement with Silicon Valley working on robotics and farming, with people trying to transition by removing people from the equation of farming. So in California, we are in the juxtaposition, as always, of presenting the technology and the advances that people think are necessary to continue the production and to increase it. And then also those that are trying to maintain the more grounded or earth-based aspects of our connection with land. So I'm seeing that. And we can only assume that with SGMA, the Sustainable Groundwater Act, farming in Central Valley is very limited. It's being bought up by corporations. Water rights are being bought up by bigger entities, that these entities will be able to farm, but medium-sized farmers, the ones that are feeding more people on a larger scale, are shrinking. So that's where the small folks come in, I think. There's, as Evan is, Genevieve, I'm sure you're aware as well, there's so many small farmers in California. They comprise the greatest percentage of farmers, although not the greatest amount of acreage. So we need to be looking ahead at how do we continue to produce on a scale that's regionally appropriate and that is really thinking with regeneration, because right now we're dealing with soils and land that has been degraded over generations.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting to think about the question of what helps those small farmers be resilient. And I know that's a nut that's been worked on for a long time. And Evan, that's what CAF is all about, really. One of the things that I'm observing in this moment is that while there are challenges with kind of our new reality that make it much less easy to thrive, really, to be resilient, to have the kind of those basic Maslow's hierarchy to be tended to so that you're able to be more resilient. There's also new ways that people, organizations, farmers, markets are connecting. I found it really fascinating to watch what was happening with farmers markets and how they adapted to the shelter-in-place restrictions and have made it possible for people to still access really healthy food in a way that was safe in this moment. And that actually that ability of connecting it online and creating other kinds of systems, I think is going to generate new kinds of markets and new ways to access different populations than was had before. So the one that I'm understanding is happening is, for example, there's boxes of roots and veggies and greens that are now available at farmers markets, and you can sign up for them and go get them. And so it's a little bit more prepackaged. So those kinds of things seem like they're kind of shaking us out of our comfort zones around how we think and work with food. And I'm just really curious, like, what you're seeing around that. And so, Oren, I think that goes to your next question, but how are you seeing small farmers use this moment creatively, and what are you seeing that they need?
Timra, Evan?
I believe that Evan has more of a perspective of the landscape. My perspective has gotten very myopic in some ways here on our farm.
Mm-hmm.
I'd love to hear like the bigger kind of landscape view, and then I can speak to our farmscape.
The question is how are we adapting?
How are small farmers adapting? What are you seeing? How are they meeting the challenge?
So the current challenge at hand, we're seeing right now is a huge lopsided impact in terms of the coronavirus, right? On one side, you have farmers who had existing CSAs, who had existing e-commerce or pickup farm stands, things like that. And every year at the beginning, usually around the beginning of March, we are scrambling to help farmers get more members, enough members to fill up the season. Every single year, it's the same thing. March rolls around, they're like, oh no, I don't have enough members. I need to get enough members to fill out my CSA for the year. And that was the exact same, as per usual. That started out in March. At the end of March, almost every single CSA in Sonoma County and most across California had waiting lists. In some cases, hundreds of people on their waiting lists. So we've seen a massive spike in CSA membership in farm stands and in e-commerce direct sales.
Mm-hmm.
So for some farmers, not to minimize the tragedy that we're living through, but for some farmers, it's been a huge opportunity to connect with their customers. And to shine a really great light on the CSA model and those direct market models, and that's really great. People are interested. They want to skip the grocery store. They want to know that they can trust where their food is coming from, that it's passed through the fewest numbers of hands, and that there's a real premium on trust. So for those folks, things are actually pretty good. But for anybody who was selling into restaurants, anybody who was selling into cafeterias, schools, or just through distribution channels, it's been incredibly hard and devastating. And we are going to see farms go out of business as a result of this. Not all farms are prepared to make that pivot. We've seen a few farms, for instance, shift and jump on to like setting up e-commerce sites where they can deliver their products, or using social media to start selling their products, or whatever it might be. But unfortunately, it's not been an equitable response. Not all farmers have the technological savvy to be able to do that. The average age of farmer in California is over 60 years old. So you're thinking about farmers in their 60s, 70s, 80s, assuming that they're going to jump on Shopify, set up an account, and switch the business models that they've been doing for the past 50 years. Unlikely. We also work with a lot of immigrant farm workers turned farm owners in places like the Salinas Valley, to assume that they're going to be able to tap into the same San Francisco, Silicon Valley networks and start selling direct to high-income families. A little bit harder, or they don't have the technical skills or the language skills to be able to do that kind of work. So we're talking right now. CAF set up a fund. It was the Family Farm Emergency Fund that provides direct grants to farmers who have been impacted as a result of the crisis. And in less than 2 weeks, we received hundreds and hundreds of applications, well over $1 million in requests. There's no way we're going to be able to provide grants to everyone who really needs one. We just gave out a few dozen, about $100,000 in grants. But again, it's like a drop in the bucket. Reading through those applications was one of the saddest things I've done in a long time. The ability for these farms to switch, when you one day just suddenly lose 90% of your sales accounts, that's devastating. And the tough thing about agriculture, unlike a few other industries, is you can't just switch what you're doing on a dime, right? Even if you're a restaurant, now granted, restaurants are suffering in huge ways themselves, but you've got a menu. If you suddenly need to change your menu, you could probably do that in a few days. It's still going to hurt. It's still going to be, a pain in the ass, but you can probably switch out, maybe take this off the menu, put that on the menu, stop. If you can't get access to this particular ingredient, you take it off the menu, whatever it is. If you're in a factory, maybe you produce less of this and more of that. Or if you're in a construction job, right? And you have to pull everybody off the job. It's unfortunate. It's going to be expensive, but you can always go back to the house and continue building when it's safe. Agriculture doesn't work like that. Agriculture is entirely time-based. And so you can't go out to your field and say, oh, there's no more market for carrots. I should switch my carrots to arugula, right? No, you planted those months ago. You planned that out. You had a plan where it was going to end up. So, and you need to harvest it in some cases immediately. So it's perishable, it's time-bound, and it's going to be one of the hardest industries to be able to pivot as quickly as folks need to stay in business. So we at CAF have been doing everything we can to again, people are still buying food, people are still eating food, people are still growing food. The food is there, the demand and the supply exist. It's just that it's been disrupted, and then that there's too much on this side and not enough over here. So we're just doing our best to try to reconnect some of those supply chains, connecting grocery stores who are selling out, trying to connect them with the farmers who've lost their business accounts, or assisting farmers in setting up e-commerce sites, or in the cases of the CSAs that have massive waiting lists, to assist to connect farmers with those CSAs to see if they can sell into their CSA. So if you're previously selling to restaurants, maybe you're raising chickens and you're used to selling them in a restaurant. Well, maybe you have an add-on and you bring it to a CSA, and now that CSA that primarily does vegetables now has a chicken add-on, and that sort of collaborative opportunity. But again, you have to get people working together and make those relationships as fast as possible before you have to start plowing under crops or laying off farm workers. So it's a really tough time, but we're seeing farmers adapt. We're just trying to make sure that it's an equitable recovery as we go forward.
Yeah. Go ahead, Genevieve.
Well, that weaving together that you're talking about, I think, is really a key to any kind of resilience, whether it's, community resilience after, 2 years or 3 years of fires, or, a pandemic. That's the piece that actually helps. And I'm definitely a silver linings kind of person. So what has been exciting is to see those ways that organizations like CAF and others are weaving together their different efforts, whether it's Petaluma Bounty, who has this amazing resource of ways that people can access food and all sorts of very specific kind of framings, or farm trails that's, helping to guide people to those CSAs and local producers, or down in San Mateo, there's Pie Ranch and Fresh Approach, which Fresh Approach has a mobile farmers market that they took to disadvantaged communities urban side. And then Pie Ranch is growing food, and they've been bagging up hundreds of bags of groceries and creating sort of an emergency food hub, which is actually something that they've been wanting in a deeper way in that area. So to see this moment connecting up farms and consumers in a deeper way is really an important thing, I think, for the future of our food system.
So as we're drawing this topic to a close, I'll make one quick comment in the chat, and one of our speakers was going to address this, but there is a significant amount of food done through our school systems, and I know it's a big topic, and I'm just going to draw awareness to it at this point, because we really can't dive into it. But do know that a lot of, especially low-income people, youth get their primary food from their school lunch, and that's a very important part of our food system, and it needs your attention and awareness. As we draw this topic to a close, I'm just going to ask you really quick, probably in about 2 minutes each, just put out your biggest dream for us. What are the things that we can as a community, attach our efforts and attention to, so that we can have a really robust and resilient food system here? And I don't have an order on this. Tamara?
Well, that it's such a big question. And I think my dream for our food system, a really resilient food system, would be that every citizen is connected to a citizen farmer. And this will require a lot of resources to go into it. I would like to see farmers supported in a way that public servants are, with just like secured payments, benefits, healthcare, like all these things that we all take advantage of through the normal working marketplace that farmers don't have access to. And I see how the lack of retirement and these kinds of benefits really impact people's ability to produce very healthy food, and having to make the decisions of being more regenerative or less regenerative with how they produce that food. So I guess my dream for our Sonoma County food system, or even broader, is that each citizen has a citizen farmer that they support, and that's supported through government, since subsidies have always been part of the equation, and currently our farm bill is not supporting the type of food system that feeds people at all. So we do need that Green New Deal, Robert. I agree with you for agriculture and food systems. And there is a bill in place. Signatures are being collected. So there's a new Californians Against Waste, and it would also create a lot of composting across the state, which we need for more carbon sequestration. Signatures are being collected online. So to get on the bill next fall, we need to get the signatures in. So there's things like that which will be limited during this time of isolation, yet greater community support than ever, that we need to be aware of and continue to pay attention to. So I'm voting for citizen farmers and citizens being attached to those farmers and supporting them.
Can you please be sure to put links to information in the chat when you're done talking, so that we can get it?
Mine's more aspirational, except for that ballot initiative.
Those are good. Genevieve?
I have a couple of different things. One is my hope is that this moment creates a consciousness of our direct connection, just like Tamara was saying, with the farmers that are around us and the farm workers that are around us, and that our isolation right now it's so easy when we're in this space to get to just be talking with the people that we know. I mean, I know for myself, it's really hard to like be building out and making new connections. And that seems like a shame. So I'm really grateful for the work of CAF and others who are helping to reinforce those relationships and maybe bring people together in new ways, in a really deliberate way. That's a very specific role that's really important. Groups, Sustainable Enterprise Conference is one of those places. So my dream is that people feel more personally connected to the food system, and that actually is what yields the kinds of changes that we need. And that, I guess, also we're also more nimble as a result of it, all across the board.
Evan?
Well, I really appreciate what both Genevieve and Tamara said. And what comes to mind for me is a Wendell Berry quote that is as simple as eating is an agricultural act. And we used to be a nation where 90% of us farmed. At this point, it's maybe 1%, and so few of us are actually connected to the source of our food. So I think that what I would hope for our food system is that people get engaged, they have conversations with farmers, they find out what are their challenges. I think it's so easy in this world that's dominated by big corporations. We kind of have this antagonistic relationship to the issues that we have, where the only way you make change in an industry is to oppose it violently, which in some cases is true if you're talking about an incredibly inaccessible company like Coca-Cola or Nestle, right? But if we're actually connected to our farmers and we know who they are and we can actually engage with them, I think it's important for everybody to get educated on what are the obstacles to sustainability. What does make it challenging for a farmer to implement the practices that we want to see them implement on their farms. I had a conversation recently with a farmer who was selling at a farmer's market, and the farmer's market shut down, and she was really upset because she didn't have a mailing list. She didn't have the contact information. She didn't really have a social media following. And so what happened was everybody knew her, everybody loved her. They knew her as that farmer who's at that corner at that particular farmer's market, but they didn't know her name. She didn't have a good signage. And so when this pandemic hit, she didn't have a way to access them. She didn't have a way to contact them and communicate with them. And now she's like, well, now I realize how important it is to be directly connected to my customers, to be in regular communication with my customers. And most of all is to not be an anonymous farmer, and that consumers should also not buy food from anonymous farmers. Otherwise, a carrot is just a carrot is just a carrot. When the truth is a carrot comes from a particular farm, grown in a particular way by a particular community. And those are the questions we should be asking before we make any purchase at a grocery store, at a farmer's market, joining a CSA.
Thank you. Thank you all. I'm sure our farmers thank you all. I know our community and our bellies thank you for your service to the food systems. We're going to transition away now into our next panel. I'm going to pass off the moderator duties to, oh, there's my notes. There's that one. To John Staten, and he's going to guide our next panel on how, wrong notes, how a culture, wow. Excuse me, all.
How a culture of perpetual crisis is shaping the future of the North Bay.
Thank you so much, John. For some reason, I just deleted my notes.
No problem.
And I'll add in, John, this is a special year for us, I feel like, because we've got a couple of the people that were originally at the table 15 years ago. And John is one of those people when we first did the first Sustainable Enterprise Conference. And one of the things that occurred to us in the planning this year, John, is that this conference was probably your idea. And so we were all at the table, but you were starting the first Green Business Masters program in the nation. And so thank you, sir, for embarking us upon this path and bringing us forth. I'm just going to turn it over to you right now. Remember to tell us where you're calling from and what community you're representing.
Sure. I am calling from my small farm in rural Windsor. I have a Strawbale Outbuilding where my office is, and so that's where I'm speaking from. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so that we can get started with this panel. Is that working for everybody? So, last year I moderated, first of all, I'm not sure I deserve the credit for the idea. I think it might have been Terry and Genevieve, but who knows? It was a long time ago. And certainly I was one of the co-founders. Last year I moderated the first panel on the state of sustainability and resilience in the North Bay. The region at the time was recovering, and still is, recovering from the 2017 fires. And we advocated for rebuilding in a more sustainable way. Since then, our region's endured the Kincaid fire and is currently enduring the COVID-19 pandemic. And it's becoming clear that our region needs to think differently. The old paradigm of experiencing occasional disasters followed by rebuilding and recovering until we kind of reach a status quo no longer fits. We need to be able to live and maybe even thrive while managing perpetual crises. Come on, I'm trying to advance the screen here, just a moment. There it goes. While participants from any region can learn from this conference, our focus is on the North Bay bioregion. For the most part, the boundaries between the North Bay counties are just political. There's few natural boundaries between, say, Marin and Sonoma and Napa counties. We're regionally interdependent for water resources, fire prevention and recovery, energy generation, and economic opportunity. But this bioregion is increasingly vulnerable to disasters. Between 1900 and 1980, there were far fewer natural disasters than you can see here in the 40 years since. In the list here, which I believe is comprehensive, there are about the same number of disasters in the first 30 years as in the last 10 years. And these are all North Bay disasters. And they've accelerated our existing human crises that were already here in this region and are especially impacting our low-income immigrant residents. We had a housing crisis, for example, even before the Tubbs fire destroyed 5,000 more of them. And that caused our homeless population to boom. And now COVID-19 is laying bare the fragility of our healthcare and our economic systems. And that's exploded the number of people, as mentioned earlier, that require food assistance. And at this point, we don't have time to feel sorry for ourselves in this situation. We've got to grapple with this situation productively in order to increase the resilience of our human and natural systems. And that brings us to the purpose of this panel. First, we want to understand the impacts of the ongoing crises and disasters on the North Bay from multiple perspectives. Second, we want to learn how individuals and institutions have been responding to these crises. And third, and perhaps most importantly, we want to extrapolate how this state of perpetual crisis will shape the future of the North Bay. And we are very fortunate to have 4 distinguished panelists representing 4 interconnected sectors for this exploration. And they're listed here in alphabetical order. All of them operate regionally across county lines. Lisa Carreño, President and CEO of United Way of the Wine Country. Efrain Carrillo is advocate for Burbank Housing and board president for the Climate Center. Joyce Lopes is the CFO and Vice President of Administration and Finance for Sonoma State University. And Cynthia Murray is the President and CEO of North Bay Leadership Council. And before we get to them, I'm going to talk just a little bit about managing disasters on the neighborhood level. According to Pew Research, only about 26% of Americans say they know most of their neighbors. And nearly half of Americans do not have a neighbor they would feel comfortable asking to keep a set of keys for emergencies. And social events among neighbors are not very common in this country. Fortunately, we do have several emergency response programs that can help us to organize and serve our neighbors during calamitous events. COPE, MYN, and Ready Together have slightly different approaches to the goal of neighbors working together to build and support emergency preparedness. COPE developed as a collaboration between Oakmont residents, the Santa Rosa Fire Department, and the Red Cross, and has now been adopted by many communities in the North Bay, as has Map Your Neighborhood, which started in the state of Washington. Ready Together is the newest program developed by Transition US, who's been supporting neighborhood resilience for many years throughout the country and as part of the global transition network throughout the world. CERT is about training citizens to be pre-first responders by providing training in basic disaster response skills. And I'm starting to work with this. This is my neighborhood in rural Windsor. A few of these neighbors my wife Anna and I know very well. We're acquainted with most, and a few until very recently we hadn't met at all. It's an economically mixed neighborhood with very, let's call them independently minded households. So we used our shelter in place to start organizing our neighborhood. The first steps we took is contacting neighbors by phone. Anna primarily did this, including some of those neighbors that we had not met yet. And then we created an email list. We used a Google group so that we could be in touch with everybody. Now, surprisingly, most of the neighbors, and I think a lot of it's because of the COVID pandemic, were very receptive to this, and actually many were eager to participate. So we're now in the process, this third step, of collecting and disseminating contact lists that include people's addresses, phone numbers, email addresses, and who lives in their households. And then shortly we'll be starting the following step of inventorying special needs that people may have in the neighborhood, and then the skills and resources we also have in our neighborhood. But these are really just the first steps. As soon as we can, as soon as we're able, we're going to start having social gatherings among those 20 or so neighbors that are involved in our neighborhood. I should say 20 or so households, and then develop emergency plans, things like evacuation plans, understanding how to turn off each other's propane tanks, etc. And we have a longer term vision of neighborhood resilience and even possible self-sufficiency as a neighborhood should the situation in this region become especially dire. And actually, interestingly, this has already started. My wife Anna initiated a neighborhood plant exchange. Because these are rural properties, a lot of people grow different types of plants, both food plants and flowering plants. And she started a neighborhood plant exchange, which has been very vibrant and really embraced by a number of our neighbors. So this, while we're still in the beginning stages, so far our efforts going well. And we've been using a blend of Map Your Neighborhood, Ready Together, and COPE. We're kind of improvising using the various paths that those three programs outline. I want to conclude the bit that I'm saying by talking about the long disaster and preparing for the long disaster. And a friend of mine, Nick Farr, recently wrote an essay on the long disaster that I'm going to quote here. Addressing the long disaster requires a radically different approach. The long disaster responder doesn't rush in because they've been there all along, working within existing networks and fostering communal efforts to prepare for the durable disasters on the horizon. Before the disaster, this work seems mundane. It is only during the disaster that its true power shows. So thank you. And we're going to start with our panelists. If any of you participants have questions during any of the panelists, please enter them in the Q&A section, and we'll get to as many as we can after their presentations. And panelists, I'll leave it up to you to unmute and mute yourselves. And because I have Efren's slides already queued up, we'll go ahead and start with Efren, followed by Lisa, Joyce, and Cynthia. So we'll start with Efren.
Good morning, John, and good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for the opportunity to join you this morning. Notwithstanding the current pandemic, it's great to see the Sustainable Enterprise Conference still happening. And ironically, this year may present our lowest carbon footprint yet, but we certainly hope to see everyone in person next year. Burbank Housing is celebrating its 40th anniversary this year. Burbank is an offshoot of the County of Sonoma, formed in 1980, and we are fortunate to be regarded one of the leading affordable housing entities here in the North Bay. In operation for 40 years, we've had the ability to build over 4,200 rental homes serving over 10,000 residents in our various communities. And John, when you share really the neighborhood focus and neighborhood resiliency, I will say that every single one of our Burbank communities embodies and shares in that neighborhood framework. And yet, even though we've been successful over the last 40 years, we still have a wait list that has about 15,000 people that are seeking housing in one of our communities. With so much angst and consternation over the last 2 months, I'd like to start with a little bit of good news, at least on the construction front. We're well under construction on a few developments, including Lantana Homes in Santa Rosa. This is an opportunity for first-time home buyers, in this case, for 48 families. A good portion of these home buyers were impacted by the wildfires. And while we've experienced a minor slowdown due to the pandemic, affordable housing remaining an essential function under the existing health order, we've been able to remain active on the construction front and expect folks to move in later this year. John, I'm going to ask you to fast forward a couple slides here, just if you can, since I don't have control of it. This is for Lantana Homes. I'm going to ask you for one more slide across here. Thank you. So it's really been just an interesting dynamic, obviously, with the wildfires and now with this pandemic, and still trying to move forward construction projects that have been in the pipeline. Next slide, please. While not in Sonoma County, through a partnership with the Gasser Foundation, we are providing affordable rental housing for 50 families in Napa County through Stoddard West. Solar and electric vehicle charging is an important component of this project, and we're excited about that. Also in Napa, we have a 34 single-family duet-style homes at Redwood Grove, and you can see that in the following slide here, John. Looking into the future and coming out of the 2017 wildfires, we were fairly active in completing a couple of communities, Catalina Homes in 2017 and Crossroads Community in 2018, both new communities in Roseland. The wildfires and most recently COVID-19 have unfortunately exponentially made our work in housing affordability that much more difficult, yet is a blunt reminder of the importance of housing and shelter to the resiliency, health, and fortitude of our community. How we move forward to create a more inclusive and equitable future, I think, will be our barometer. and we're certainly committed to that work. Next slide, John, if you may. Caritas Homes is a partnership between Burbank Housing and Catholic Charities in downtown Santa Rosa, near the northern end of the Santa Rosa Plaza. Next slide, John. This project was originally slated to be about half its size, but in response to the housing crises and after the Tubbs fire, our focus on this transit-oriented development with close proximity to SMART and Santa Rosa's transit hub was not to build a parking structure and have some housing sprinkled around on the side, but to prepare for a full transformation in mobility, in how we get around, and create true density downtown and transit options being prioritized. A majority of you may, next slide, John. A majority of those here on the conference may not have heard of 3575 Mendocino Avenue and the proposed development in North Santa Rosa, but I'm guessing that most of you have probably heard of the site more commonly referred to as Journey's End. We are proposing 102 affordable rental homes and close to 500 market rate rentals at the intersection of Mendocino Avenue and the Mendocino Avenue overcrossing. John, next slide, please. And while it took us a full 2 years in waiting for the state agencies to respond as to how to move forward, we are excited to be working on entitlements, permits, and the funding for re-envisioning of this site and demonstrating what resiliency may and should look like after a disaster. Next slide, please, John. We're fairly early in the process on this partnership with the Kashaya Band of Pomu Indians, but this site in the town of Windsor will someday house low-income members of the tribe, as well as provide office space for their programs and operations. And while Burbank is lending its expertise as a developer, we hope that through this process, Kashaya will have been equipped with the expertise necessary to seek their own low-income housing development projects down the road. We feel that that is an important component of our work. I'm going to transition a little bit here to the most important element of our work, and that's our residents. And while construction is what drives our business model, our residents are why we do the work. As expected, COVID-19 has had a direct effect on many of our residents, primarily due to loss in wages, layoffs, or other financial impacts directly attributed to COVID-19. John, next slide, please. We've seen an increase in calls, texts, emails to our resident services team, nearly 200 calls for assistance over the last 2 months. We've also seen a growth in the number of households that are seeking and obtaining rental payment agreement plans due to an inability to pay rent. And while Sonoma County has instituted the necessary protections for renters, our commitment from the get-go is to ensure that all existing households impacted by COVID-19 would remain housed. As we enter new phases of the shelter-in-place order, best practices will continue to be implemented, and we're also in the process of setting up a rental assistance program for residents to close gaps in the most extreme cases. John, at the next slide, I'd like to conclude my remarks by inviting participants to learn about a couple of initiatives taking place in our community. And I'd be remiss if I didn't put a plug in for a couple of organizations doing great work in the housing and climate arena. The latest crises insist that we think strategically in our housing and climate work. Generation Housing is a new entity focused on vibrant communities where everyone has a place to call home and can contribute to an equitable, healthy, and resilient Sonoma County. I'd invite folks to check out generationhousing.org or reach out to Executive Director Jen Close. They are slated to host a slew of webinar events for Affordable Housing Month this May, the first of them taking place tonight. The last conclusion I'd like to make in my part here is another initiative, and that's one that the Climate Center and its coalition partners have been working on to encourage leadership in Sacramento to include funding for green, clean, and equitable economic recovery investments. The last 2 slides here, John, we're focusing on including directing funds to local governments for community clean energy resilience planning. Sonoma County has been hit hard not just by the fires, but also by the public safety power shutoff. And I think we're well positioned to lead in this space in terms of on-the-ground implementation and also engaging Sacramento leadership to fund this. You can learn more about the Climate Safe California platform by visiting the center's website, which is on the next slide. In conclusion, our housing and climate work is absolutely interconnected. In the end, providing housing security to our community is truly only relevant if we have a planet we can all call home to start with. John, look forward to the questions and to the engagement here with the other panelists, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here this morning.
Thank you, Efren. That was a very interesting presentation, and it's great to see how much great work you're doing, yet that pales in comparison to the actual demand. So thank you for that, raising our awareness in that. I will start addressing some of the things that people have asked for and put them in the chat shortly. But continue to put your questions in there that you want to ask the panelists that we'll ask after the conclusion of the panels. And we will go next to Lisa Carino.
Good morning, everyone. And John, thank you very much for putting together this panel and for the prompt. I have to admit that when I first received, the theme for the panel, how a culture of perpetual crisis is shaping the future of the North Bay, I felt literally a sort of a visceral reluctance and a visceral resistance to the idea that a culture is coming out of this. And it was just, kind of an honest gut reaction. And yet I have to acknowledge that, that over these years of fires, flooding, drought, public safety power shutoffs, now COVID-19 and its economic impacts are in fact helping us create a culture. I see in the experiences I have as a leader at United Way and also a leader with Los Yang Sonoma County, with the Rebuild North Bay Foundation, and with the Community Foundation, Sonoma County. First and foremost, a pervasive experience of community and a cultural grief that we all share, that we don't often talk about, and a kind of PTSD that lives with us and is a companion in the work that we do, whether or not we acknowledge it. I deeply appreciated Pam starting our meditation today with an acknowledgement of our grief. I think the other thing that we've really learned a lot over these last 2.5 years is also how pervasive racial inequity is. And I recall early in my work on the steering committee of what has become Los Yang Sonoma County, a real reluctance among all of us on the steering committee to use the word racism and talk about the word racism, and this fear, and Efren, you might remember this as well, you were part of that early group of owning and claiming that is the specter that we must confront. How racism particularly affects all of the systems that provide the framework of our living. It provides access or a lack of access to all kinds of systems and all kinds of resources and opportunities. The crises, the disasters of the last 2.5 years have exposed all of that and continue to reveal the highly nuanced ways that inequity affects our lives and those of our neighbors. That exposure and the opportunity to learn together and the opportunity to talk about and reconcile the benefits or the lack of benefits in the systems for everybody, to talk about institutionalized depression beyond racism, I think is another really key outcome of these last 2.5 years. And as we look at that, I think what we're now seeing are the ways that especially safety net systems are strained and stressed. Most importantly, the strain and stress on families. We're really seeing how these crises affect and strain and stress our schools and school communities, the nonprofit sector, all of our first responders, and we have in this COVID-19 crisis broadened our definition of first responders in paradigm shifting ways. We're now thinking of farmers and the distribution system for food as a part of our first responder system, and I've never heard us talk about that way before. And we're recognizing too the stress and strain on our cities and counties. This gives us an opportunity, I think, to make 3 big decisions as we confront what our local culture has been and what our local culture needs to become to be resilient, to be truly resilient. Because the strength of our community is in fact in our resiliency. And the three big decisions are simply this: to pause, to see what all is being exposed to us, and then choose the culture that we want to create. Be very intentional about how we will work together, whether we will work together. What are the underlying core values that we're going to live and make visible and measure in the work that we do together? What is the vision and the purpose of the work that we do together? And what are the underlying grounding assumptions and commitments that we are going to promise to make? The opportunities of these crises are that we as a community must choose really intentionally in these 3 core areas of culture, core values, our vision and purpose, our grounding assumptions and commitments, because if we don't, we will miss this opportunity. And the gaps and the lack of access and the degradation of our neighborhoods and our communities, and most importantly, our families, will continue to devastate not just the region and the economics of the region, but this place we call home, right? So having said all that, what I want to say that United Way of the Wine Country is doing is, as we look at our organization for the next 50 years, our pivot is to examine exactly these factors and choose to align our organization in sync with a commitment to investing in families and strengthening communities throughout our 5-county region, from here in Sonoma all the way up the North Coast to the Oregon border. We're going to be building plans over the next few months. We're in the midst of a business model analysis and strategic plan that are going to align our work with advocacy, coming out as equity advocates and warriors for advocacy, if I may, investing in exactly the exactly the initiatives that I've already highlighted: investing in families and strengthening communities, and advancing, demonstrating, and fostering collaboration wherever and however we can with partners who are similarly committed to best practices around building community and building shared community impact that is at its core founded on the principles of racial equity. So I think I want to leave it at that, and look forward to answering questions.
Thank you so much, Lisa. And we will go now to Joyce.
Good morning, and thank you. Thank you for putting this together and for finding a way to do this remotely. It's so important for us to still have these conversations. And I also want to thank Pam and Robert for the opening comments. Those were both very helpful in the framing. As you know, Sonoma State has provided higher education here in the region since the 60s. In the last several years, and we educate about 8,500 students, and on any given day on our campus, when there isn't a pandemic, we have 10,000 people on the campus. So we run a small city. Since I arrived here in August of 2017, we have had to stand up our Emergency Operations Center 5 times. The fires in 2017, the Camp Fire in 2018 that created the smoke out and the huge issues with air quality. We had a homicide in the residence halls in 2018. We had our main water source fail in 2019 and had to be under boil water notice for 3 days. And then in 2019, we had the fires and the power shutdowns. And now in 2020, the 6th time for our EOC to be open for the pandemic, and we have been operating in our emergency operation mode now for over 50 days. And as others have alluded to, when we think about emergencies, we used to think about if an emergency occurs, but now we think about when the emergency occurs, because we know there'll be another one, right? We're already preparing for the next power shutdown, and we have a drought season on us. The other thing when we think about emergencies, at least in the university setting, we don't use the word crisis. A crisis is an emergency we hadn't planned for. So we use the word emergency because we plan. So when we plan, we bring a strong team together who can run the emergency. We train them in NIMS and SIMS, right, in the National Incident Response System and the State Emergency Management System. And then we set the EOC up, and we trust that they will figure out how to work through this process and keep our students and our community and our campus safe. And they have done that. All the times we've set up an EOC, they've done it well. We planned for a pandemic. We had a pandemic plan. We had a fire plan. But we have never planned for any of these emergencies to the proportions that we have seen them. We didn't plan for the fires that happened in 2017. We had no idea it could be that great. We didn't plan for a worldwide pandemic where we all are at home, trying to manage our organizations remotely. What we planned for was just to work through an emergency, to get through an emergency, to buckle down and figure out how to manage through 3 days or 8 days. And I look back now at 2017 when we said we had the Emergency Operations Center open for 10 days. That's unprecedented. And now we've had an Emergency Operations Center open for 50 days, and that's unprecedented. So we know there'll be more emergencies. And now we need to think about, as many of you have already alluded to, that this is something we learn through and we move to a higher place in our planning. And these emergencies do drive home that we aren't all on the same playing field. You know, in higher education, we often think of the university as the great equalizer. This is a place where students from all walks of life can come together, they learn together, they grow together, and they realize their academic and career goals together. And then something like this happens, and we're all in a remote format, and it isn't equal for all. The economic and social realities that our students face, and indeed the greater community, as Lisa and Efren have alluded to, are very clear during an emergency. They're under a microscope. When we have to evacuate a campus, some students don't have any place to go. Some students go home to a place that isn't safe. We have students with food insecurities. We have students with mental illness. We have students who are dealing with so many issues. And when we move our instruction to this remote platform, we don't have the support services that are on ground available virtually to support our students. So we have students who don't have access to necessary technology. When we're dealing with air quality conditions because of a smoke out or the realities of COVID vulnerable, some of our students are at a significant disadvantage because of their underlying physical conditions. And those, like I said, those programs that are in place on ground, it's really difficult to connect our students to those services when the day-to-day rhythm of the campus is interrupted. So we're finding ourselves in higher education being in an ever-changing role, particularly as we deal with these emergencies. And we need to figure out ways to come together to ensure equity that's valued as we manage these emergencies. We need to ensure resilience, as we talk about that, is something everyone can access. Whether that's helping a student get a Wi-Fi connection, finding a hotel room for them when they don't have a safe place at home, keeping the residence halls open, opening up an alternate care site to help the community with health, the necessary health services, ensuring everybody has an N95 mask when we have air quality concerns, or addressing the stigma responses that target populations during an emergency. And the pandemic has certainly brought that to light. So we have to continue to look at how we expand and work across all of our segments and all of our agencies and organizations to partner and provide support more broadly. And as Lisa mentioned, Sonoma State as well has a strategic plan that's focused on student success. It's focused on ensuring leadership values are instilled in our students and in our campus. It's focused on helping the community with the types of educated employees that you need to run your industries. And we want to continue to keep those focus in place as we move forward. It's really looking at how do we manage the emergency on this day-to-day basis? How do we ensure that student has a food to eat, a place to put their head, can still get logged in remotely? We ended up going remote in 4 days. By the way, I don't even know how you set up remote classes in 4 days, and I give so much credit to our faculty for their resilience and their fortitude in getting that done. They were amazing. But we have to figure out how to do all of those pieces while at the same time staying focused on our strategic plan and our strategic priorities, and finding ways to ensure social equity for all involved. And particularly, of course, with a focus to our students. So my greatest hope is that we can just evolve through these emergencies and find ways to improve those networks and to ensure equity for all as a society. And that's why I think this conference is so important for us to keep this dialogue going about how we support each other to build these resilient networks. Because certainly the future of Sonoma County, and indeed the future of the state of California, hinges on these students who we are so diligently trying to educate. They will be the ones that are caring for all of us someday. So we really need to work together to support them. So those are my thoughts as we think about how we try to move forward in this new environment.
Thank you so much, Joyce. And now let's go to Cynthia.
Good morning, my brothers and sisters. Thank you so much for having me here today and for giving us a chance to come together. I think you're seeing a theme this morning that what we need to do is work collectively, and how much we need each other to make any of the things that need to happen happen. So I'm delighted to be here to talk a little bit about my optimism for the future and how I think we can get some multiple benefits out of things that need to be done now and going forward. I truly believe that we are in a disruption now that can be good, bad, or both, and that it's up to us to make the great lessons of the pandemic and other crises be learned. So crisis is a great teacher, and it's up to us to learn the lessons and to be able to grow from them. I think that we can see how we take these disruptions and use them positively to reset our country's economic and social structure and find measures that can counter the impacts of the coronavirus and climate change at the same time and make the next normal, not a new normal, not the old normal, but the next normal, a better world. And we can do that through greater economic, social, and environmental resiliency becoming core to the planning for our recovery and the reset ahead. And I think we have some things that we can use right now to see why that's possible. We've had an unimaginable change in our lifestyles in just a very short period of time. Who would have thought in January that we could get so many people to go home, stay home, practice social distancing, change all the ways they do things, from their lifestyles to their business operations to how they interact with each other. No one would have thought it was possible, but we did it. And those things we can see, and those changes have really helped make improvements in the environment. We've talked about it, how we've seen the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. We're now seeing places like India where you can actually see the mountains, which they hadn't seen in decades. And just major changes that can foretell that there's great possibilities for us to move forward in a way that's going to be much better. So if you look at what do we need to do to solve the pandemic impacts and what do we need to do to solve the impacts of climate change, you can see that there's so many commonalities. One is both are global. The second is that both affect people in different ways. And the third is that we can see that now we have just a greater understanding of the importance of government and having a government that's effective, and also being able to base actions on science. You know, we've had this move away from science, but if anybody doesn't learn the lesson that science is critical for us knowing the path forward, then they haven't learned what's going on. I found this great report in McKinsey & Company that I want to share a little bit of, and they talked again about how pandemics and climate risk are similar. One is that they're both physical shocks. So that is, and they translate into a variety of socioeconomic impacts. In contrast, there's financial shocks, which is what we saw in the recession of 2008. And those are within the financial system, and they're usually remedied by restoring consumer confidence. But a physical shock can only be remedied by understanding and addressing the underlying physical causes. So that's a big difference right there. But also you can see how it weaves the two together. The other is both of them have short-term performance needs and long-term resiliency building needs. So we have some immediate things we have to address, and then we have to look at it over the long term. That is sort of a horizon planning. And then you can see how we've already had so many of our assets in our economic ecosystem, from healthcare, infrastructure, supply chain, cities, all were having some struggles before we had the pandemic impacts because they operate in a very narrow band, but this has only exacerbated that. And so when we look at how do we start to repair some of these things, we know that we can see that the cost so far has been extraordinary. I think we're up to $5 trillion just in relief packages, and that if we had done more in terms of prevention and going forward looking at how do we prevent worsening impacts, it'll be much cheaper. than what we've already seen that we have to spend to try and go back and fix and repair the damages that have been caused through a lack of preparedness. And finally, both climate change and the pandemic response are tragedy of the commons problems. I love that term. And that's where the individual actions can run counter to the collective good and deplete a precious common resource. And that means that one individual can go out and cause major, major damage to all of us. So we have to look at this as, again, we have to have global coordination and cooperation and a collective response, because it is a tragedy of the commons if we all don't act in the same way. So I guess another thing that really has been driven home to me is that this is less of a situation that's geographic and looking at, you know, how does one city do versus another, or one country versus another. And so for us to find the solutions, it's more about looking at the differences between problems and solutions than boundaries. So I think that again drives home the need for us to have collective action. The key that makes me feel so excited and optimistic is that when we have these disruptions and we have things that have happened both in lives and livelihoods, we know that there's going to be efforts to go out and rebuild and reset. And so if we can help drive those actions and that funding and the way things are done to rebuild and reset, we can really make the changes that need to give us the resiliency to survive future crises. So right now we can see we've got a lot of businesses that are shut down. And as they look at how are we going to bail them out or get them to be able to reopen, we can start to say, are there opportunities to accelerate change and even during this disaster and build it back better than it was before? And so if we say, okay, part of the rebuilding of the economy is going to be around how do we get off of fossil fuels? How do we move to more energy independence, more renewables? You can see that investing in those things could create jobs, which we're going to need to do, help drive capital formation, and increase our economic resiliency for future crises. Right now, the lower interest rates could really accelerate the deployment of new sustainable infrastructure. You know, we've heard the whole time in the Trump administration there was going to be some big infrastructure package. Well, this is the perfect time to make that infrastructure package be green and do what we need to do to make us in that position of resiliency going forward. It's time to decarbonize. You know, this is perfect time to retire a lot of the carbon intensive assets that we were already starting to see fading out, but let's accelerate that. Take a systematic and through the cycle approach to building resilience. Let companies have, as they've responded to the pandemic, started to experiment with a variety of approaches, such as shorter supply chains, higher energy efficiency manufacturing and processing, video conferencing instead of business travel, remote working, and increased digitization, I can't even say the word, digitization, I still can't, of sales and marketing. So this, I think, is going to see that companies see these are working, that this is really something that their productivity is up, their employees like it, the customers are responding. So we can help reinforce that and keep it going. There's no need for anything to revert back to what it was when these new ways are proving beneficial.
Yeah, could you bring it to close pretty soon here, Cynthia? It's been great.
Oh my goodness, I didn't even get anywhere near. Sorry. So let's keep trying to push for teleworking and using these other ways to help correct the inequities exposed by the pandemic that others have identified, and really try and make sure that more than anything that we see how quickly things can change, and that as we look at solving both of these problems, we know that people can change their actions on the dime if needed. We just need to do better education and make sure that we use this by working collectively to save lives and livelihoods. We can do both. It's not an either or. Thank you. I'm sorry I went over my time.
No worries. Thank you so much for your comments. And we're going to go to some questions now. I've got a number of questions, but I think we'll go first to the participants here. And one, I'll ask anyone in the any of the participants to answer this in the chat section, but we'll see if the panelists have an answer. Who worldwide has the best expertise about using disaster response and recovery as an opportunity to improve equity, economy, and environment? Do any of you have any ideas or resources for that? Any successful models that you're aware of?
I don't have anything off the top of my head. I see, you know, day to day, certainly through higher education, how it continues to evolve as an industry and continues to put students' needs and social justice first as part of our strategic planning. But I can't say that I have an example of a best practice across the board.
Okay. Anyone else? I don't see anyone answering. So there are some good comments being put in. So that's why we're crowdsourcing the answer to some of these. Do we have examples? And this was, I think, brought up especially during Lisa's talk, but anyone can answer it. Do we have examples about how racism and racial inequality has impacted the resiliency of our communities? And having tangible or quantified examples would be powerful.
Well, I can give an example just in terms of the CARES Act. I mean, that funding, which provided $4.5 million for Sonoma State, specifically to give grants to our students, is a tremendous support for our students. But because it came federally, our DACA students are not so our undocumented students are not part of that funding. And we are looking diligently across our community, our donor base, for funding to provide support to those 300 students on our campus, just our small little campus, who will also desperately need that support. So that's one way, just very systemically, where I think it comes to light.
Thank you.
I'll add that just to put a fine point on the CARES Act inequities, that no family was going to receive support from the family stimulus package if any member of the family was an unauthorized worker. So, a mother and father of 2 children with, one person in the family who is undocumented is totally shut out of any federal support. That's affecting, tens of thousands of families in our own community, just in Sonoma County, and many tens of thousands more across our region. And it's all about racism. That is just all about racism.
John, I'll add to that. Our experience residents in our communities are the most impacted members of the residents we serve are those that are undocumented, that cannot access any federal assistance. A lot of the residents who have received payment assistance through the CARES Act are utilizing portions of those for food, immediate necessity, and offsetting some of their rent costs. And yet, unfortunately, a good portion of the undocumented members that we serve don't have that same opportunity. So when I mentioned in my comments around resident services and addressing those with the most extreme cases, it is those members of the undocumented community who either don't have access to the same resources or are afraid to access those resources because of their documentation or immigrant status and inability to be seen in the same light. I think coming out of the wildfires, we saw a similar dynamic with the impact of folks either losing their homes or losing their rental dwellings. A lot of the assistance, unfortunately, did not trickle down or has not trickled down to those members of this community. And, I think most of us would argue that it's blatant racism and it's impacting those that are most vulnerable.
I think if you take it beyond just the undocumented, which is a tragedy within itself, you can also see that California had gotten in the first round of the CARES Act less than 10% of the money from the federal government, which is very disproportional for what we contribute as far as population and economic value to the United States. I think in the second round, we've gotten around 13%. And the people who need that money aren't really the ones getting the money. It's been the more larger businesses. They're still small, but they're larger, but are really small businesses, which tend to be more Latino and African American, have not been able to take advantage of that either through lack of access or banking or something like that. And so it's been very disproportional who's had access to that money. And I'm looking for more data on, the industry differences too, because I think we're going to see that there's been a lot of groups that have been shut out that really need the assistance and they're just not getting it.
And then, John, I would just add, we all know that the healthcare system is not equitably available to everyone either. And that has led to COVID vulnerability in people for certain populations of people that just don't have that kind of healthcare access, so that they've got these underlying conditions that create a real dilemma in that space.
There was also a poignant article in the Press Democrat a couple of days ago regarding hunger and how it's disproportionately hurting undocumented workers who are now unemployed and do not have access to other resources and are cutting down to one meal a day and deciding who in the family should eat. And that's happening here. I think that's another way, that somehow that's been okay in America for that to happen. Definitely shows underlying racism. Thank you for that. And we've got just a few more minutes. I'm going to ask maybe to finish up for each of you to give a minute or so to answer, what do you imagine as the state of your sector or your sector, the populations you're serving in 5 years from now? Given the direction things are going, what's your vision? What do you imagine where things will be in 5 years? I see your face up, Afrin. Do you want to start?
Sure, John. Thank you. Specifically on the housing affordability, I think what we've seen is some very strong leadership coming out of the county, coming out of our local cities, jurisdictions. I know council members McKenzie and Fudge are both on the conference, and we've seen folks be proactive in addressing not just the housing instability, but also the effect around homelessness. I envision greater collaboration between local governments, between affordable housing providers like us, as well as community partners and stakeholders. These are nonprofits, education, academic institutions, and businesses to really begin to formulate that particular pillar of quality of life, which is housing. There are a couple efforts that I hope folks will get behind. In the state legislature last year, Assembly Bill 1487 was passed that essentially creates a framework regionally to address housing inequality. Right now, Metropolitan Transportation Commission, an association of Bay Area governments, is currently discussing a regional housing measure that could bring in potentially upwards of $10 billion into housing construction across the Bay Area. Yes, it's a tough time to be talking about revenue measures, particularly with this pandemic and what's happening with the economy. But I do envision our community collectively responding to the crises here. And hopefully in 5 years or before then, our community here locally and statewide can respond to the climate crises that has been evident now for the greater part of the last 3 or 4 decades in the same way that, or a similar way that we responded to this pandemic. Individually, we can certainly collectively get there, but we do think that it takes partnerships and collaborations to do that. We need the same type of urgency we see with this pandemic in housing affordability as we do in our climate work. Thank you, John.
Thank you. Lisa.
You know, over the next 5 years, I see United Way of the Wine Country collaborating across sectors with business, government, community-based organizations, and families to genuinely help families and communities get stronger and more resilient. Largely, I think by providing the kind of access to resources that families need to permanently break the cycle of poverty, to lift them out of poverty, and to do so in a way that structurally changes the paradigm of the lives that they've been living. I think what often happens is that families get access to resources for a time, and then there's a crisis, and the family is, you know, is clawed back into poverty. We really need to understand what that framework is that keeps perpetuating the cycle of poverty, breaking it, largely by looking at the inequities and inaccessibility to access to resources, and fully equipping them to have access to those resources. We need to be allies in that fight. And I see us moving more and more towards a regional approach to taking that fight to the systems and dismantling.
Great, thank you. Joyce?
I think in higher education, we will continue to need to look at the whole student as we, move forward. Not just the educational aspects of how we educate the student, but how do we hold and care for student holistically. The other thing is, I think in 5 years, higher education is going to be pushed to really think about how to move more of its education to an online platform. There certainly is, and I do not want to discount how important on-ground work is, but I think there's going to be more and more call for us to provide online aspects to our education, as well as telecommuting opportunities for our employees, which I think will again help us to be more sustainable and more resilient as we think about how to do that while providing the quality of education that is so important in educating a student through that process.
Great, thank you. Cynthia, we got 1 minute left. Why don't you wrap it up for us?
Thank you. Well, I think in 5 years, I hope that we realize how important it is to elect the right people to represent us and lead us, because government has never been more important in being able to help provide a cohesive response. So I hope in 5 years we'll have a big change at the federal level in leadership. I hope we invest in workforce upskilling and reskilling for all the displaced workers to help them find jobs in the new economy that we're going to be creating. I hope we continue to adapt and adopt mitigation measures that will help us be more prepared and ready to weather any kind of crisis going forward. And most importantly, I hope we figure out that we all need each other and that we need to work collectively for these goals, because if we do it, we can get it done and we will have a better new normal.
Excellent, thank you so much. Okay, turning it back over to you, Warren.
Thank you, John. Thank you, panelists. I'm just reminded again of how fortunate we are to live in a community with so many well-intentioned leaders looking out for our future, looking out for our underserved communities, and driving us to a more sustainable future. So thank you all for joining us today. I know your time is very valuable. I appreciate your comments and for being part of our community here at Sustainable North Bay. Our next presenter is an answer to the question, we always like to bring some art and culture into our day. You can see Christine working in the background, creating our graphic. She's done that for us for years, and we're really thankful. It's a great reminder of time and space where we are. I promise in the near future to get a retrospective of all the graphic arts up on our new website so that we can look at those over the year. But our next presenter is out in West County. Lawrence, are you with us? You're mute. All right. Lawrence Jaffe is a member of the Sebastopol Grange. He's the current chair of the board of the North Bay Credit Union. He has earned a BA in politics from the University of California at Santa Cruz and earned a Juris Doctorate from New College School of Law and Social Change. Lawrence is a lover of music, gardening, and community. And one day, right after we got our shelter-in-place orders, I cruised to social media and I saw Lawrence. So, Lawrence, take it away.
Good morning. I've been doing some hard traveling. I thought you know. I've been doing some hard traveling way down the road. I've been doing some hard traveling, hard rambling, hard gambling. I've been doing some hard traveling, Lord. And that's from Woody Guthrie. I'm sure you recognize it. And thank you. I'm Lawrence. And a new thing. I'm the farm market social distance volunteer. Note this 6-foot sign made on the back of a Grange breakfast sign. Well, I love history, and I'm entitled to, I think, take a super long view here. We all know that our national identity is being reshaped right now in real time. But let's look back. Let's look back. I mean, we're undergoing the largest change that any of us have ever experienced, anyone alive right now. We're making history, and history matters. We've always been working together for the last 25 years in Sonoma County, hoping to make big change. We've just been talking about the kinds of big changes we've been looking to make. We've been working, we've been preparing, we've been developing our personal skills. I think we're never going to be ready for the change of this size, but I want us all to know that we are ready for this change. Absolutely. Historically, times like these have had a major impact on human rights and dignity, sometimes for the good, and that's what we're working on this time, but not always. But in history, it is the advancement of human rights that are the stories that we most often tell. Look, we just celebrated Passover. That's a 3,400-year-old story about leaving a place for better conditions. The Magna Carta was a struggle for human dignity. The American, the French revolutions, the social and environmental justice movement that we're still participating in. Well, here we are at one of the big changes in history. It's here right now. How do we know what to do? How can I? How can we? How can you? How can we all together move us towards the healthy global civilization that we want? And what are the characteristics of leadership that we need? Well, I want to introduce you to an early Roman statesman, a hero from before Rome was an empire. And you probably already know his name, but I doubt you know his story. This statesman was Cincinnatus, born about 200 years after the founding of Rome and 200 years before Caesar. Cincinnatus was a farmer. And as a young man of 29, he served a year in the Senate of the city-state of Rome and returned to his farm. About 2 years later, Rome was attacked by enemies from both the north and the east. Rome took its volunteer army, split it in half, and sent one half in each direction. One half to the north, one half to the east. The half to the north was decimated. The half to the east, too far away to come back and defend the city from certain defeat and occupation. Well, when threatened, Rome had a tradition of choosing one person in whom they put all of their trust, all of their authority. We now call that, by what we consider a bad word, a dictator. But at the time, dictator was yet to be a bad word. It was considered to be the call of the hero. And so the senators, in their panic, elected Cincinnatus as their leader for this crisis to serve a 6-month term. They went to find Cincinnatus, and they found him on his farm with his plow. Of course, Cincinnatus rose to the call, left his plow in the field, entered the city, and proclaimed the suspension of all public business and had all the shops closed. Isn't that a strange echo from 2,200 years ago? Next, he requested all of the men of Rome to assemble. And being a clever strategist, he marched them all day, 12 hours, and reached the invading army by nightfall, had his army work all night to build a wall around the invading army. And in the morning, when he was ready to order an attack, seeing that they were surrounded, the invaders surrendered. And being a magnanimous leader, he did not kill the entire army. He let them return to their homes, to their farms and their fields. And so a peace of a sort was made. Victory being swift, our hero Cincinnatus returned to his farm. His total time as leader, 15 days. So for 20 years, after having saved Rome, Cincinnatus continued to grow his cabbages until he was called on again. And this time the enemy was famine. There was a famine in Rome, and one citizen Spurius, had bought vast supplies of wheat and was intending to personally give the wheat to the hungry citizens of Rome, thereby having them swear their allegiance to him and having himself made king of Rome. Cincinnatus, again, called from his farm field, abandoning his plow, marched to the city. Upon hearing that Cincinnatus was coming, Spurius tried to flee the city and was killed. His wheat distributed amongst the hungry people, his house turned into a public gathering spot and a monument to the saving of the Republic. So that's our hero, Cincinnatus, from Rome. But coming a little closer into history, say about 1454 years, our hero, George Washington, another movement to expand civil rights, laid down his sword to Congress, having completed the war and retired to his farm. And 5 years later, he was called to be president, and having served 2 terms, he again laid down his office. When he could have been king, when he could have gathered all of the riches, he laid down his power, just had Cincinnatus, both of them becoming the ideal, the hero who springs into action, does what needs to be done, and then retires to the field without gathering power or wealth. So this is why the city that we all know, probably haven't visited, but can identify as being in Ohio, Cincinnati, was named after George Washington. George Washington, the American Cincinnatus. It was the first city built after the completion of the American Revolution, and it was built to honor, to honor these ideals of selfless sacrifice, of showing up when called, and of being willing to relinquish power without enriching oneself. So, can we be as heroic? Can we learn from this example of dignity? We were all, like Cincinnatus, like George Washington, we were all successfully pursuing our careers, our families, doing the business of community. And we have all been called to retire to our farms, to our gardens, to our patio gardens. We've all been like Cincinnatus, growing our cabbages, like George Washington, back to the farm. However, it hasn't been years for us, it's just been weeks. But in those weeks, the world has entirely changed. And one of the things we know from history is that you cannot underestimate the magnitude of change all at once in these situations. We're being asked to return to public life and take part in our new history. And we already have the skills that we've been developing, and we already know the work that we need to do. We need to do the work in our communities. We need to provide directly for our neighbors and our extended neighbors. And we need to continue working to build the alternative infrastructure so that our communities can get their needs met. We're the builders. We are the new Cincinnatus. We're not going to be heroes of the entirety of Rome, perhaps, or heroes to the entire United States, but we are called on to be heroes in our neighborhoods, in our communities, and in our businesses. We're ready. We have the skills. These are the same challenges that Washington, Lincoln, our presidents, Roosevelt, these are the same challenges that Katie Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, these are the same challenges of FDR and Martin Luther King. These are the same challenges of Greta. These were our challenges. And we're here. We're here to make history. And history matters. I've been doing some hard traveling. I thought you know. I've been doing some hard traveling way down the road. I've been doing some hard traveling, hard rambling, walking. I've been doing some hard traveling, Lord. Thank you.
Golly, thank you, Lawrence. Thanks for that perspective from way out west in the West County. Good day, sir. Our next panelist, if 15 years ago when we started this, I would have been thinking that now I'd be introducing these two panelists. I would have been giddy for 15 years. And so it's truly my pleasure to introduce this next topic. And these next two collaborators, Gilfriend and Pooran Desai, I've challenged them to the question of what could we be doing now? So really quickly, Gilfriend is the founder, chair, and CEO of Natural Logic. Many of you have seen him speak with us before. He's helping companies design, implement, and measure profitable sustainability strategies. He's the founder of the new Critical Path Capital, a family of funds. He's one of the most 10 influential sustainability voices in America. And Pooran is an associate at Bioregional. He's a lot more than that. That's just the way it came out in his bio. He was voted in the UK's top 5 most influential people in construction for the decade of 2010. He received the 2009 Skoll Award for Social Entrepreneurship and a World Economic Forum 2011 Schwab Award as a European Social Entrepreneur of the Year. Pooran is our connection to the One Planet Living and the OnePlanet.com framework. Pooran and Gil, are you guys ready to go?
I am.
Ready to go.
All right. My launch off into this conversation is just how I framed it. You guys have a global perspective. You work with clients, giant clients and small clients. You've been involved in some of the most fascinating projects I've read about. What is it we could be doing with this time?
Well, let me start with some questions, Oren, and we'll get to the answers in our conversation. The one thing that's clear now is that nothing is clear. We're in a time of massive uncertainty. Everybody recognizes that. The joke, of course, is that we're always in a time of massive uncertainty. We just sort of take for granted that things are predictable and normal, and now we know that they're not. Warren Buffett famously said that when the tide goes out, you get to see who's been swimming naked. And the time is out now, and the COVID crisis and frankly the climate crisis are revealing things about the world that we're in. Let me see if I can share my screen real quickly here. You see that?
Yeah.
So, you've seen these curves before. You've seen them all over the place. And just to cut it short, this is, this is the picture of the COVID crisis, and this is a picture of the climate crisis. The exponential runaway, the flattening of the curve, if that's possible. This also shows us the disconnect of the worlds that we're living in, the exponential growth that black line to the left going straight up, is what we look for in the world of economics. It's the pattern of compound interest. It's the pattern of the hockey stick that Silicon Valley wants to see. It's the growth on growth and growth on, that Wall Street wants to see. But the other curves, the sigmoid curve or the S curve, are the curves you see in biological systems. You see growth and a leveling off of growth in the face of constraints of resources or predation or so forth. Two different worlds that don't understand each other and don't speak to each other. And a large part of our mess is that we're in the confusion of those. The worlds are disconnected. The worlds of finance, economics, business, and policy doesn't understand or talk with the world of biology and chemistry and physics. We've got a breakdown of solidarity, a breach in what Doris Lessing called the substance of we feeling that connects all life. And in very practical terms, we see both a tremendous outpouring around the world of coordination and collaboration. Rapid action to deal with an imminent visible crisis, and also horrible breakdowns in our ability to coordinate that in the United States, at least, is so severe that our blindness to the data has people defaulting into ideology instead of into evidence. So that's the mess we're in. And I think the opportunity opens because we create our worlds in conversation, in how we speak with each other. In how we listen to each other, in conversations with our family and our friends, with our business partners, our customers, our investors, our elected officials, and frankly, ourselves in our internal dialogue all the time. And there is a place where we have the opportunity to reinvent ourselves, and by doing that, reinvent our communities and the ways that we work together and the worlds that we are going to bring forth out of this mess. Notable, there was a poll out of the UK a couple of weeks ago that asked people if they wanted to go back to pre-pandemic times. And stunningly, only 9% said yes, which tells me that people recognize that something here is different, that they value. And something was taken for granted in the prior world that they don't value. And for me, that puts us at the threshold of new worlds. So I'm very interested in the conversations that we're having with each other and with the people that we don't normally speak with. Conversation meaning not just how we speak, but how we listen, what interpretations we make, the mess that we get into between confusing our assertions, our statements of what we think are true that are testable on evidence, and the ones that are assessments or the interpretations that we make that are not bad. That's what humans do. We can't not make interpretations, but we sure as hell better know the difference between testable statements and interpretive statements, because that's where we are going to live in our interaction with others. So let me leave that as a kind of opening provocation. Pooran, I think, is going to get a lot more grounded and specific, and then we'll talk together for the rest of this half hour. Pooran, over to you.
Gil, thank you very much for that, and it's fantastic to be talking to you. So I'm speaking to you from the UK. I'm going to share three things about what I think we could be doing going forward. And Oren knows, and others know, I like to be a bit controversial, and I don't do that necessarily just to have a bit of fun. It's partly that, but because it makes life a bit more interesting. But also, I think we are the narrative that we've had for the last 50 years in the post-war period, or 70 years, is not going to carry us forward. And I would say actually the narrative for the last 300 years and scientific narrative, actually I would say is not going to carry us forward, which might surprise Gil a bit. So I'm going to start with that oh, maybe not. Okay, good. I won't prejudge. I won't prejudge.
Have that.
I won't prejudge. So the first thing is, for me, it's we have to get real now. I think that we are not going to avoid catastrophic climate change. We are not going to avoid collapse of ecological systems around the world. I've had the privilege of having private conversations. I got invited to Davos, the World Economic Forum. Very interesting, of course, in its myself. The only invitation I've got where they said if you're arriving by private plane or helicopter, here's how you can get to us. Very strange event, but nonetheless really interesting people there. And I got private conversations with 3 of the top scientists, and I asked them all individually, where are we heading? And all 3 of them separately said, we are heading for a planet which will only support 500 million to 1 billion people. And when I pushed one, I said, when? He said, within the lifetime of people alive today. Now, he's probably the #1 Earth system scientist, or most recognized. So, we are probably going to increase global population to 9 billion. And then, unless we change absolutely drastically, we'll have a correction of the global population down to about half a billion to 1 billion people. Now, I'm hoping that's not going to happen. And I think we can do a lot in terms of harnessing technology, ingenuity to avoid that. But we have to wake up to the reality of that as, something that we are facing. And it'll be within the lifetime of people alive today. So, I'm old enough, Gil's old enough, I think we'll see some bad things happening, but it's really the kids of today and the grandkids, and our kids and grandkids who are going to face this. And the conversation has to move into that space of what are we going to do in this. And, Extinction Rebellion started moving that conversation, which was brilliant. And we need to move a bit further into that. And that, just getting rid of disposable straws or reusing a carrier bag. Yeah, okay, good, but don't think, don't think that's nearly enough. The second thing is, really, we're going to have to be values-led. There is far too much conversation about facts and science, okay? We can argue for hours about facts. The scientists, we can argue about scientists interpret information. They provide us with information. But let's not forget that most of the world's problems, I would say, have been contributed to or caused by scientists. If we didn't have scientists, we wouldn't have climate change. We wouldn't have the science to find and extract fossil fuels faster and better and convert them, into energy to power our cars and power our power stations. So we wouldn't have a problem so far around the world with loss of soils if we didn't have scientists telling our farmers better ways of farming, which have destroyed our soils. So science really, isn't objective in that sense, and particularly reductionist science. And as we move to systems type scientific thinking, we get a very different interpretation of the science. So we have to be values-led. What are the values on which we are going to build a future? And what's going to be so important is how we collaborate and cooperate. That's what's made us successful as species, is our ability to cooperate. And our ability to cooperate is not on the basis of fact, it's not on the basis of science, it's on the basis of our values. So let's be much more clear, move the debate away from facts and argue about whether climate change is real or not or whatever, to, okay, what are the values which we share? And those values on which we're going to be able to cooperate and build what I think the third thing is that we should be doing, which is build sustainable, or even actually we now need to be talking about regenerative communities. And we need to look at the hardware of that, of course, the energy, the water, the food systems, but the software of sustainable communities is going to be even more important. And the software of the communities is really the culture of those communities. And the communities which are going to thrive or survive and perhaps even thrive in the coming decades are going to be those communities which are able to cooperate around shared values. And I'd like to give a little call out here for Somo Village in Sonoma County, where Brad and his colleagues have been working on a development where they have been embedding those sorts of values. So it can be done. I've been supporting developers around the world on those sorts of communities. So the three things again: get real, let's be values-led, and let's start building regenerative communities. And that's the best way for you, yourself, the people around you to have the best chance of, getting through the next few decades.
Well, Pooran, as is often the case, we violently disagree on most things and strongly disagree on some things. So it always makes for a juicy conversation. So let me respond to a couple of things. We'll go from there. Get real, absolutely right. What that means in my mind is getting real about the relationship between the human economy and the living economy. Or as my wife Jane often busts me, says, honey, it's just one economy. It's not two that need to work together. It's one. So reality-based economics, reality-based accounting, ecological accounting, getting the prices right on what we pay for things in the marketplace, this is fundamental, and we completely agree there. Second, when you talk about science, I have to ask you, what do you mean by science? Because in fact, science is not something new. It's not the last 100 years or the last 300 years. It's been a human enterprise for as long as we've been human. It's a process of experimentation, testing hypotheses or ideas we have against how they play out in the real world and learning individually and together about it. That's what science is. And I think what you're decrying, as well, you actually said it, you said reductionist science, or I would say maybe capitalist science. I've taken to hyphenating the word capitalist lately because capitalism isn't the thing. The thing is the elevation of capital above all other forms of wealth. So science in the hands of that becomes distorted in the way that you're speaking about, but it's not science, which is fundamental to how we live and learn as human beings. Third, on the point of value-based, truly fundamental, but not in the absence of these other components. And I see this playing out so profoundly in the world of economics, where when people talk about Medicare for all or Green New Deal or regenerative economies, the immediate response is always, well, how are you going to pay for that, right? How are you going to pay for that? Now, notice that with the COVID stimulus response, there was no question of how you're going to pay for that. We had to do it. We fit it. We generated the money to do it. When there's a war, there's no question of how you pay for that. You do it. So the question here is, what's the world we want? So this is echoing what you're saying. What is the world we want? How do we want to live? How do we manifest the resources to bring forward that world and not be constrained by arguments of neoclassical economics or some other kind of bullshit?
Yeah. Okay. So Gil, again, I'm going to pick up on the bits we disagree with because it's more fun. And done, of course, in good spirit. Look, for me, it's not about the economy, okay? Of course, that's part of it, but all the time we look at the economy, we look at price signals. Look, the economy that we've got is probably completely shot. Mm-hmm. The idea that we can find money, okay, we've done it for COVID, but how have we done that? Quantitative easing is basically countries borrowing money from themselves. Now, okay, if I could borrow money from myself, I'd have 10 houses, I'd have 2 Ferraris, the latest electric Tesla, and I'd be making an offer to Richard Branson to buy his island, his Necker Island. So actually this thing that we have made money to pay for the coronavirus is not something that we can continue. And this idea that we can pay for everything, economics is based on it has to be based on the idea of scarcity at some level. So I really do think, actually it's not going to be through the economy that we create the future. It's going to be cooperation, probably outside the main part of the economic system. And of course, a lot of our economy isn't actually captured by the formal economy where we pay for in dollars. And I suspect the way out is going to come through new currencies and not through dollar-based currencies. So that's not to say we shouldn't try, but I can see a complete collapse of our economic system. We have put something like £500 billion, which is about a third of the UK economy, as a stimulus package into our economy. And we have no idea who's going to pay for that, how we're going to get the economic growth, which the current system is dependent on, to repay that. So come September, I think we are going to see a world in complete and utter turmoil in how to cope with this. So, you know, I don't think we're that far off seeing a fundamental problem with our economic system, and we're going to have to look at different ways of allocating resources. And I think that's going to come through, for example, alternative currencies, very rapidly deployed.
The last thing you said, I think, is really important, is how do we coordinate and allocate resources? That's the core question. Currency is a mechanism. Digital currencies, alternative currencies are still currencies. They're different currencies than money currencies, but they are still basically a way of coordinating resources. They're a conversation about commitments that we make. The economy, there's no such thing as the economy. That's something that we talk about. It has these elements. And so I'm not, when I say the economy, I'm not concerned with Wall Street and the Federal Reserve and the flow of money. I'm concerned with how do we as humans move resources. And that's back to your point about values-based. What do we care about? How do we do this? And at fundamental level, that takes a very new kind of conversation about what it is that we care about. We see in this country, I don't know if it's quite as bad in the UK, but a profound bifurcation in the culture. You know, and so while a lot of us, I hope everybody on this call is working actively to win the election in November, to get Trump and his gang of thugs out of office, but also to retake Congress and state houses and governorships and so forth, where reapportionment happens and so forth. If we succeed in doing that, which is frankly existential for this country and the world, we still have a mess to deal with, which has got a ruptured social fabric in this country. We have a third of us who can't speak to another third of us without getting into fistfights. And unless you envision a world where one side dies off and the other side survives, we have to find a way to live together and bring forward this new world that you're talking about together. Across some values that are very different, true, and some values that are fundamentally the same. Because if you gather Trumpers and Green New Dealers in the same room together and have a conversation not about ideology and political strategy, but about personal concerns and cares, lo and behold, you find that we are almost in agreement on most things. We differ on how to get there. But in terms of a world that is, you know, healthy and fair and takes care of children and is safe and so forth, generally there's broad disagreement. We've wound up in a dialogue where we'd rather fight about what we disagree about than find unity and build something on what we agree about. And that, I think, is our fundamental political challenge.
Look, Gil, that's where I can agree with you 100%.
Well, you didn't know.
So what you know, and where I think the left has fallen down in the last few years is, and we saw it with the Remain Leave vote in the UK in terms of Europe, was a fundamental, I think, arrogance and a failure to recognize how they themselves make decisions on the left. Okay, and so the whole discourse and campaign around Leave and Remain in the UK from the Remainers to stay in Europe was around facts and figures and objective. You know, look, here are the facts, and if you don't believe them, you're some sort of idiot. And the whole Leave side was around actually values and aspirations, what it is to be truly British. You know, and you know, the Leave vote absolutely trounced the Remain vote from a position of you know, where Remain was always expected to win, and
very steep stair step by age. Right?
Yes, but what I'm saying is, for me, the problem was that we weren't talking. The Remainers weren't talking about the values of Remain. They were talking about, let's look at the facts. And, you know, absolutely, they do not look at the facts either.
Very.
To be honest, I mean, look, you know, I come from a medical background. We do not look at the facts. We got scientists. We do not look at the facts around health. You know, our healthcare system, great, but actually, when you look at it, you know, for a start, at least 50% of people who turn up at a doctor shouldn't be there because they're primarily modifiable diseases. We look at actually, you know, it's the impact of health provision on the health of the population as a whole is like number 6. It's not number 1. You know, it's diet, it's lifestyle, it's environmental pollution. And yet we spend a disproportionate amount of our GDP on what we call our health system, which really is an illness system. It's treating people who have got ill, who should never have got ill. Because we haven't created the right education systems, we haven't created the right environments, we haven't created the cities where people can walk and cycle, we haven't created the food systems which keep people happy, we haven't, we haven't created a healthy system. So for me, this whole thing on science, this whole thing on facts, rather than what is it we want to create, which is where we agree, which is where the dialogue is. And I think the left of politics has to shape up. It's flogging a dead horse at the moment, and it has to talk about values. And I think when we talk about values and we get the conversation right between the political divide, and left and right is an odd divide now. You know, it's not sure we even works on that polarity anymore. You know, it's as much an age divide as anything else. Let's talk about values, which is, I think, where we agree.
This is a place, I think, where the UK and US examples are strongly parallel. And again, a failure on the left, but a different one, which was a failure to listen. The left, for the most part, is not connected. I'll take myself as an example. I don't spend a lot of time talking with people who are Trump voters. I have a couple of them who are very dear friends, and we have phenomenal conversations together. But what the Democrats didn't hear was a cry of pain from the heartland. People who are suffering, who are feeling their lives collapsing, their economies collapsing, feeling like they're not being heard because they weren't, feeling not respected. And would have voted for a Democrat candidate if it was one who spoke to that. That was where some of Bernie Sanders' strength was coming from, but would not vote for a Democrat candidate who considered them deplorable. They went to somebody who was echoing, resonating something for their pain. And so this is why I say, again, it's not, you know, when I talk to friends on the left about this, they say, yeah, we need to go out and speak to Trump voters. Say, no, you don't need to speak to Trump voters. You need to listen to Trump voters. Yeah. You need to hear what's real there as the pain, and as we've said before, the values that underlie that, because my hypothesis is that there's a lot of commonality, but my assertion is that we only get to where we want if we can build unity across the divide. We cannot create the kind of world that you're talking about and that all of us are gathered here to talk about with a shredded social fabric. Now, good news is that at the local level where a lot of this work has to happen, it's easier to have those conversations than on, you know, CNN or Fox News or the halls of Congress. When people sit down together in their homes, like the Living Room Project has been doing around the country, like Search for Common Ground has been doing, and talk about what really matters to us, what might we do together to build some unity around what matters to us, and agree to set aside the differences. Because one of the weird things in the political dialogue, at least in this country these days, is that if I disagree with you about one thing, I can't talk to you about anything else. Yeah. And in fact, the art of politics and negotiation and living in community, and frankly, living in a family, is learning to agree where you agree, disagree where you disagree, and work out ways to live together and move forward together. So that's, you know, that I think is one of the themes that this conference has been strumming for a really long time since its beginning, is how do we locally, in small communities and larger communities, build the examples that make the proof, that surface the values, make the proof of how to live with those values, and say, take these examples and steal them, propagate them, run them everywhere.
Yeah. So Bill, I would go I would take just a slightly different perspective on that, which is, it's not about us creating example communities. I think it's about us creating those we live ourselves. So you know, as you know, you know, I've put together the Beds Ed project.
We're not different there. We create them. We're not creating them to be examples. We create them to live in, and people will learn from each other on what's
yeah. So but I think there's still that thing about creating them as examples. What I would say is actually it's not about creating them as examples. It's about creating them as places which are good for you and which you know, other people may learn from. But to be less arrogant about that, about creating examples, I would say, you know, embodying it so that you live that. So you live, I, me, whatever, whoever lives that. And I think we're going to be forced into this position anyway, that actually in the coming months and years, and it might be sooner than we think, that actually if you are not in a community which is cooperating, you are going to find it very difficult. So I think to some extent what we are talking about in terms of cooperation is going to be forced upon us. Now, how we cooperate then becomes the issue. And I think what we have the great opportunity to do is cooperate along a narrative which says this has to be, you know, this has to be good for people because we build that trust by saying it's good for people. But we have to add this now, this other part which hasn't been in the in a narrative, at least in I would say a lot of Western societies and modern Western societies is it has to be good for the planet as well. You know, we've had a dialogue which talks a lot about human rights, doesn't talk about human responsibilities. You know, it doesn't give value to nature in the same way. You know, so a narrative where we are talking, it has to be good for people and it has to be good for the planet, is the narrative for a society which will be regenerative. And I think not many of those are going to appear in the next few years. So I'm thinking there will be places where it happens, but I think we are headed to a world which is going to divide. And so I would say, you know, getting real, think about yourself, think about your kids, think about your grandkids. Where are they going to live, and can they build regenerative, sustainable communities around themselves, or move to them? And you know, I think it's going to be that sort of story. We have to wake up to the reality of that as something which will likely unfold in the next few years.
I'm going to break in here.
Already.
I'm going to break in here because we're running to the end of our time for this topic. And the question was posed, you know, really what's possible here in the US or even in the North Bay? What are the activities that we could be doing that aren't possible in other places? And so that's the question, and I'll ask you to like summarize your remarks and answer that question all in the same minute and a half, 2 minutes.
Pooran, you want to go first?
Yeah, you can have the last word, Gil. Yeah, no, so what can happen?
Right here in California.
And one thing we're doing, I mean, I've been working, you know, on these sustainable regenerative communities around the world for a number of years. Been working now on technologies to help create those and help people collaborate. So one of the things we're doing is we're going to do a bit of an experiment in Sonoma County. I've created with colleagues a platform which enables people to collaborate on shared outcomes. So it's really based around a shared values idea. And we're going to try that and see whether we can do that at a Sonoma County-wide scale. So on the 22nd, we're doing a workshop. Warren's organized it. I'm just helping facilitate it. And we'll use our oneplanet.com technology. So some real, really new technology which enables people to collaborate in ecosystems.
An experiment sounds an awful lot like science, Pooran, be careful. So what there is to do here is, some of it is what's to do anywhere, which is for each of us to live our own values as fully as we can, to invest our money in support and in alignment with our values as fully as we can, you know, which includes, you know, to, as I said before, to vote, get out the vote, get people registered and turn the leadership of this country around. But not just vote every 2 or 4 years, recognize that we vote every single day with every dollar that we slap on the counter. We're voting for a future. So all of us need to line those things up. And then think more broadly about what is the world that we want. Who do we need to have conversations with to have a chance of bringing that forward? And somehow find a way to live with some calm in the midst of the massive uncertainty that's going to characterize the rest of our lives. Purin, one of the places that we differ is that I'm not inclined to make predictions about how many billion people, how fast, or how many billion dollars, how fast. I know that we're in a world of change, and one of the things we need to do is to get comfortable living in a world of change and operating and, you know, surfing, sailing, whatever your metaphor is, and developing the muscles to be able to handle that. I posted a link in the chat for a Zoom forum that I'm holding tomorrow at noon. I've been doing these every couple of weeks for the last month to enrich these conversations. So all of you who are attending here are welcome to that. Purin, do they have a link to get hold of you?
Yeah, I think, Oren, I know there's a question there for link. Oren, could you let people know where to get on the link for the workshop?
Yeah, thank you both for joining. We will be following up with Purin on May 22nd. That's a Friday from 9 to 11. We're going to have a One Planet workshop. Many of you know we've been working with the One Planet framework for a number of years. And so Purin has generously agreed to help the Sonoma County and North Bay area integrate our action plans into the new OnePlanet.com tool. And so we're going to collaborate on that starting May 22nd. Gil does have a weekly call-in. Is it weekly, Gil?
It's bi-weekly.
Bi-weekly call-in where you can engage with him and other hundreds of other leaders in the space. It's a really active group where you'll get inspired. We'll have a link to that in both places. Gentlemen, thanks for joining us today for this delightful conversation.
Pleasure.
Yeah, thanks, Oren. Thanks, Gil.
Oren, thanks for being willing to wrestle.
Yeah, I'm just thrilled. So as we come to a close today, and we are going over, we thought we might be in this position. We're going to stay here for a few more minutes and bring this thing home a little bit. I'm going to have some call to actions for our close. And right before I do that, we're going to hear from Ray Lucchese. I think you just got a screen share. Ray and I have been really engaging pretty solidly since 2017. Ray is a principal at a group called Regenesis that is looking at the regenerative project and applying it in many different ways. We serve together on the board of the Redwood Empire chapter of the U.S. Green Building Council. And we've been having an ongoing conversation about this place, about where we are, Sonoma County, and the beauty and the abundance of our ecosystem. And in that conversation, we've been having a lot of back and forth about language to discuss this topic, and then how we might pick some priorities for our action. And so, Ray, remind us where you are, and then let me know when I can advance your slides.
Where I physically am on the planet?
Yeah, sure.
I'm in Healdsburg. I'm in Healdsburg, a very quiet community anymore. So thank you for letting me share. This is not about telling this is an answer to something or our technology that we use is the answer. It's one way to see how you may want to engage in developing your place and its relationship to who you are as a community. So where I want to start on this slide is only to offer that this is not about things, it's all about relationships. In our world, in Regenesis world, sustainability is a byproduct when a community is healthy. It is not an aim. And so what is being called for now we can go to the next slide, is really what I'm focused on. So that's our tech, what we call our regenerative development, and it is what it is. It's harmonizing human activities with the continuing generation of life as we continue to develop our potential as humans. So, and the live, work, play was a SEC theme 2 years ago. So I just want to bring it forward and understand that the way we live is understanding and living our unique place by inhabiting the land in a relationship of partnering with nature. How we work, our work and our contributions to a community are place-based economies of integral relationship through reinvesting into our place and community. And our play is recreating. That's purposely hyphenated because that is the same way recreating is as recreating is in our sports and things. But this is a more ancient way of understanding that in our play we are recreating ourselves in a relationship to a changing world and to our place. Realizing, and this is the big thing, that behavior development is more essential than our technology. That's it on that one. So another funny word is actualizing capacity and realizing value. And I'm just going to walk you real quick through 6 essential values, but it's important to understand that Maslow stopped at self-actualizing. And what's being called for is systems actualizing of our places. So think of it that way, that we're not looking for the individual to develop as much as we are that the collective community is developing, and those individuals are in the place working that way, being that way. So in our world, there's 6 essential value-adding process of life. The first 3 are a triad that sits on top of water. We use funny words, we call them gerunds, where we put ing at the end of things like fooding versus food. That's purposeful to make you think that getting food is only one part of a fooding system, that it is about nourishing life. It's an interdependence of species between webs of fooding systems, and the ecological, human, and economic systems are part of this notion of fooding. So the sheltering systems or growing habitat it isn't about building houses. It's more about building community in a way that allows us to transition through all stages and phases of our life. So sheltering habitat supports critical functions and stage of development. It brings grandma home. They're not in a home, they're part of the community. And then the third one, and these 3 are essential, they're a triad, they come together, is transacting, which is exchanges of life. So platforms, exchanges of life, information, resources, and value adding partnering, okay? Cool. Then there's 3 more. These 3 cannot exist unless the first 3 are healthy. And the entry point in appreciating culture is how we adorn ourselves. Tribal is not First Nation as much as, or First People, as how a community behaves. It has a tribal quality. It's belonging declarations. Venerate communities. This is regarding our community with great respect. So when we're healthy in those first 3, we have a capacity to do this. If we're also build the capacity to recreate our systems, connecting with meaning and spirit, restoration, self, and education. And to Joyce, at Sonoma State, one of the roles of education in the future will be disruption, or to be disruptive in the thread of thinking and morph the system at Sonoma State to be ahead of and help move forward what's becoming. The last one is the communing, which is the big word, harmonizing orders of life that go beyond personal and individual. These 6 values, or 6 work together as a system, okay? And what I just offered there is that same thing I just offered as words. That's a way to see it as a system diagram. Some people, like me, I'm a graphic guy. I don't read well, but I can. So this is available. And what it's showing there is the actualizing capacity across 4 levels of the ecological place, the human, social, and economic, all four of those should be considered as we're growing the habitat, value partnering, appreciating culture, evolving who we are, and again, being agile to move and adapt and to stay in place and to help that place be in relationship with watersheds, and water is essential, and make that how we are communing. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Ray, you'll leave it at that.
I'll leave it at that.
There's no leaving this conversation. If anything I've learned from speaking with Ray, there's only engaging deeper. And I'm gonna take a moderator's privilege real quick and see if Gil or John just wants to pop in. Robert, Lisa, since you're on the panel, let's pop in with any of your own closing remarks. Don't feel any pressure to do it, but you're welcome to take another moment.
No, if I may, I just want to appreciate Gil and Horan for the dialogue that they just engaged in, and to Ray for ending with this articulation of these 6 values that are interdependent and create this kind of new system of collaborative, coordinated, cooperative living. I deeply appreciate Gil pointing out the finding in the study that only 9% of people surveyed want to go back to the way the world was before the pandemic. I think that knowing that we are creatures of habit and comfort and creature comfort, we are going to be drawn imminently back into comfort zones, and creating the space, creating the encouragement, creating an appreciation for bravely entering the void of not doing that. It seems to be something that we're each going to need to remind ourselves of on a daily basis, and call others with whom we work closely to do as well. Because this is an ultra marathon. Thank you for the conversation, and thank you for all those points of wisdom.
Thank you, Lisa. I think one of the things that's notable from the UK poll, and I don't know what the numbers are in the US, is that people seem to be saying that in some ways they're more comfortable now. Not of everybody. I mean, this is, privilege shows up very clearly in this story. But people report they're appreciating the calm, the less intensity, the sense of cooperation with family and neighbors. There are qualities that are already there and present. They can touch and taste. And people may want to revert to what the previous normal was, or the momentum of the systems that we live in may carry us there. But we're really at an unusual moment where, what we've taken for granted is gone. And so everything is open. And we're standing on a threshold. We step through a doorway into something else. And the big question is, what is that? And it is what we make it.
Dr. Gerling?
Well, I've been following the chat, and I found that our community did a wonderful job of crowdsourcing and sharing information along the line. I found the whole conversation today extremely stimulating, and kind of sets the agenda for what we need to be doing over the coming year in terms of responding to some of the questions that came in, and moving towards that golden swan moment that I did do. So thank you all for the comments.
Horan or John? John's good.
Yeah, no, thank you very much for joining this conversation. I think, I enjoyed, Ray, your bit at the end, on how to create these regenerative communities. Completely agree that there is something above self-actualizing. And I just want to say, I think we've got fantastic opportunities coming up. And just to mention, I was just looking at some of those questions there. I think California, and particularly, well, North California, has got a really interesting culture and is one of the places to watch in terms of what might happen in the next. So I'd say it's one of the hot spots to look out for what the future might be. So yeah, I love it personally.
Yeah, and
I love you guys.
I love you too, Warren. So I'm gonna close things up just for today. The conversation is wide open. We're going to keep having it here. I look forward to convening in this space. In some ways, Zooming has made, or being at home has made these conversations propel faster. And it's certainly easier to share our time with people in far distances. So thanks for participating. I've got a few closing remarks. They aren't, they're mostly call to actions. First thing that came up today a lot, vote, vote, vote. Encourage people to vote. In America, we need voting. We need everybody that cares to vote. Second thing on my notes is ADUs. I'm an advocate for accessory dwelling units in our community. I think we could do a really cool creative thing with a lot of natural products and small spaces to bring low carbon housing to market quickly. It's very community oriented. In the last 6 months, I've done a lot of walking around the core parts of Santa Rosa, and I'm just really, really happy that I live in Santa Rosa and very excited for the future of our community and our city and our county. Support your local food system. I would love to see a big market. Like I used to live in Seattle. I'd love to see a Pike Street market, Santa Rosa, right as you got off the train in downtown Santa Rosa, where food became the center of our conversation as you entered our community. It's a dream. I'm going to keep putting it out there. Get off the train and see our food. I hope it happens. And then in every way possible, localize, get to know your shopkeepers, support them, find a way to not take the easy path on shopping and having things delivered to your house. Call them, find out if they have the object you want, find out if they'll order it. Just really do everything you can in that, in your activities there. In Sonoma County, we're very blessed again to have Go Local Cooperative. Support Go Local, go to their website. It's in the resources. Do just support those businesses, our small businesses, all you can. There's going to be a conversation that we're hosting about community currency. Allison has been very active today in the comments and chats, is a big advocate of community currency. They'll be working with Go Local on that. There'll be a weekly call on how to get engaged in that community, and we'll have that in the resources. And all of you that signed up for this webinar will get an invitation to that and to our next convening under Sustainable North Bay, which is the oneplanet.com investigation. We're still putting together that, but that'll be on May 2nd. Anybody that attended this will get an invitation to participate in that. You'll also get an invitation to Gil's thing. I'll probably send that out today. So you can go ahead. That oneplanet.com conversation will be a deep dive into their One Planet collaborative tool. Corn has been very generous to help us get that kick-started here. So we'll be looking for our partners and our collaborators on that next event. Unless I'm forgetting anything, thanking you all for participating. Christine Walker. But
can we see Christine's screen?
Yeah, I was going to say, just as we close up, Christine, I don't know, you can click on it where it says pin video, and you can make it full screen for yourself. We'll be putting this out. Christine, would you like to take just a second? Or shall we just look at it?
Oh, yeah, well, you may not be, it depends on what you're looking at, might be too small. So yeah, I'll
Oh, no.
give you a JPEG, but overall, I would just say that the locality, being here locally, was iterated many times, as well as the global aspect. We are here. So we are here in Sonoma County, we're in the North Bay, we're in California, and we're on our planet. And for certain things, it makes a lot of difference that we're here, in terms of, say, certain kinds of food growth. But in other cases, it makes a lot of difference that we're here all together. And so as we look at the local, we also look at the global. And I always choose to kind of listen for the most optimistic things. So I didn't dwell a whole lot on the more dark scenarios, but I do think that the wake up to the possibility of the depopulation of the planet needs to be kept there as a thought, as well as, you know, we create our world in conversations, and I'm an optimist and save lives and all of these things. So what I try to do is capture what's being said without a lot of the solutions, because I think that those are the reason we're here, is to generate the best solutions that we can find. And what those solutions will come out of this continued kind of questioning and dialogue. So it was for me, it was a great conversation, and I really loved the Golden Swan because it gave me a lovely little character to work with. I always like that. Yeah, any questions?
No, thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, and then I had said that I would do this, but I was considering this. I'm just gonna put a link to our regular Zoom chat in the Zoom. I'm gonna shut down the webinar now, but I did just put a new Zoom link in there that I'm gonna open up at 12:30, like our happy hour. And so it's a meeting link, everybody will be able to talk. I'm only promising to be there for 15 minutes, but there's a few people I'd just like to Zoom in with that were in the audience. So I'm gonna shut down the webinar now. Thank you all. It's been a remarkable day for me. I really appreciate everybody. Look to the Zoom chat and then look to your email for a follow-up. Goodbye, everybody.
Everybody.
Bye.